I never thought I'd find myself here, deep in the forest, with nothing but the sound of needles crunching underfoot and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The kind of forest where the sunlight barely reaches the ground, where the air smells sharp and damp, and where even the birds seem careful about when they sing. My friends, Eli, Mara, and John, were ahead of me, laughing softly, but even their voices felt muted by the trees that seemed to swallow sound whole. I followed them, carrying the packs we had carefully prepared, feeling both excitement and an uneasy twist of something I couldn't name. We had chosen this place deliberately. It wasn't on any popular trail maps. The old guidebook I'd found in the library mentioned it almost as an afterthought, as though warning the reader not to linger too long in its depths. Some hikers vanish here, the text said, underlined in the margin like someone had scrawled it themselves decades ago. I thought it was a joke. I thought it would make for a story we could tell later around the fire. But as we walked deeper, I started to realize the forest wasn't just old. It was alive in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand straight. The path was barely a path at all. Pine needles had carpeted it so thickly that our boots made almost no sound. Branches clawed at our clothes and roots rose like gnarled hands from the soil, threatening to trip us if we weren't careful. John stopped suddenly, pointing at a mark on a tree. "See this?" he said quietly. "Some kind of carving." It was faint, just scratches on the bark, not letters I could read, just lines that looked almost like they were drawn by a claw. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the rough ridges, and a chill ran through me. "Probably someone messing with hikers years ago," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice seemed too loud in the quiet. Even Mara didn't answer. She just frowned and looked around, as if expecting something to move in the shadows between the trees. We kept going, and the sun began to dip lower, brushing golden light over the trunks and illuminating clouds of dust and pollen in the air. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, but beneath it, I felt a subtle tension threading through my chest. I noticed how the shadows grew longer, how every tree seemed to stretch taller and closer together, until the forest felt like a cathedral, silent except for the soft crunch of our boots and the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the wind. Eventually, we found a small clearing. It wasn't much, bare earth, a few stones arranged in a rough circle, and a fallen log that could serve as a bench, but it would have to do. We dropped our packs and started setting up the tents. The air was cooler here, damp against my skin, and I could smell the forest in full. Pine resin, wet earth, and something else, something faint and musky I couldn't identify. I paused for a moment, looking around. The tree line was thick, almost too thick, and I realized we could probably walk 10 yards in any direction and already be hidden from anyone who might pass by. Eli struck a match, lighting a small campfire. The smell of burning wood made me feel a little more grounded, a little safer, and we all settled into the easy rhythm of making dinner and arranging our gear. Yet even as the warmth of the fire reached me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was there, at the edge of my awareness, a weight pressing gently against my mind. John laughed, tossing a small branch into the fire. "You're overthinking it," he said. "There's no one out here for miles. You'd have to be crazy to follow us into this." "I don't know," I said softly, and Mara gave me a look, her eyes narrowed. She said nothing, but her silence was louder than any words. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the crackling of the flames and the smell of coffee simmering in our little pot. It was peaceful in a strange way. Too peaceful, maybe. Night fell quickly. The forest changed almost instantly. Shadows that had been soft and golden in the sunset hardened into black shapes, tall and jagged. The wind moved differently, brushing against the branches and making the treetops sway like restless hands. Even the sound of our fire seemed smaller now, insignificant against the vast dark around us. I heard a snap, a branch maybe, or maybe a footstep. My head jerked toward the trees. Nothing. Just the thick blackness pressing in, and a strange rustle, almost like someone breathing softly behind the shadows. Mara was sitting close to the fire, her knees drawn up. She whispered something I didn't catch, and I leaned toward her. "What is it?" She shook her head. I feel like we're not alone," she said. The words were almost too quiet, and for a moment I wanted to laugh to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. But I couldn't. I had the same feeling. Something in the forest was aware of us, studying us, moving just beyond our vision. We told stories, trying to keep our minds busy. Tales of other campers, hikers who had gotten lost and never returned. We spoke in hushed tones, soft enough that if something was out there, maybe it wouldn't notice us. The firelight flickered across our faces, and I could see each of us staring into the darkness, imagining shapes and movement where there was none, or maybe where there was something we couldn't yet perceive. Hours passed slowly. The forest remained silent except for its subtle murmurs, the wind rustling through pines, the occasional drip of condensation from the branches above. And yet, every time I shifted in my seat, every time I leaned closer to the fire, I felt it, a presence, patient and still, observing. I told myself it was just my imagination. The forest is old. It plays tricks on you. But even as I whispered these words to myself, my skin prickled, and I realized the old guidebook hadn't been joking about the hikers who vanish here. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was exhausted, but sleep was uneasy. Every sound was amplified: the brushing of leaves, the soft cracking of twigs, the distant calls of nocturnal birds. I could swear I heard something else, something smaller and more deliberate, moving quietly just beyond the firelight. I pressed my back against the wall of the tent and tried to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that tomorrow we would hike back to the trailhead, and all this tension would vanish. But deep down, I knew the forest had already noticed us, and I had the creeping sense that, in this place, noticing was the first step toward claiming. As I drifted into a fitful sleep, the last thing I imagined before the darkness took me fully was a pair of eyes, faintly reflecting the moonlight, watching from the tree line. I woke to the smell of damp earth and the faint smoke of the dying fire, the sky above the clearing dark and still. The forest had changed while we slept. It felt older somehow, heavier. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their trunks thick and black against the moonlight. I could hear the soft breathing of my friends in their tents, though even that sounded loud in the thick quiet of the woods. For a moment I lay still, listening, and tried to convince myself that everything was normal. That the rustling outside was just the wind, and the shadows that pressed against the tree line were just shadows. But I could already feel it, the subtle tension, crawling under my skin like tiny insects, pressing at the edge of my mind. I stepped out of the tent, careful not to disturb anyone. The fire was a small heap of glowing embers now, flickering weakly, casting long, jittering shadows across the ground. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, boots crunching softly on pine needles, eyes scanning the blackness beyond. That's when I heard it, a faint snap of a twig just beyond the firelight. I froze, my chest tightening, ears straining. It could have been a deer, I told myself, or a branch falling, but the sound had weight, intent like a footstep. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. My voice sounded absurdly loud. Eli stirred in his tent. "Hear what?" he muttered, his voice groggy. I shook my head, not wanting to wake the others, but the sensation wouldn't leave me. Something was moving out there, quietly, almost patiently. I could hear the leaves shifting, faint whispers of movement. Nothing tangible, just a hint of presence. My skin prickled, and I felt a strange tightening in my stomach. I wanted to call it imagination, but the feeling was too real, too insistent. By the time the others were up and we had some coffee, the forest had grown lighter, but the shadows seemed to linger in corners where light didn't reach. Mara refused to make a fire, saying the smoke would draw attention. I agreed silently, though my hands shook as I passed her the coffee cup. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Every snap, every rustle felt deliberate now. Every movement in the trees seemed to mimic our own. It was as if the forest was learning us, memorizing our steps and waiting. John tried to joke about it. "Relax, it's just the forest," he said, stretching and yawning. "You're letting your imagination run wild. Trees don't follow people." but I couldn't laugh. Mara didn't laugh either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the shadows where the forest thickened. Even Eli, usually so quick to brush off my concerns, avoided the edges of the clearing. I watched him occasionally, noticing the way his gaze flicked toward the trees, and I realized we were all starting to feel it, the creeping awareness that something unseen was moving among the trunks. The morning passed in careful, quiet observation. Every sound was catalogued, measured, and doubted. A bird calling from the top of a tree became a signal. A distant rustle of leaves made us flinch. I found myself imagining shapes in the darkness, tall, thin figures standing just beyond the firelight watching. I knew they weren't real, at least I told myself they weren't, but my mind refused to stop shaping the shadows. The more I focused, the more I felt eyes on me, following my every movement. We decided to explore a little, just a short walk down the path that led deeper into the forest. Nothing unusual at first. Pine needles cushioned our steps, the air was crisp and clean. The sun filtered through branches in thin, pale beams. And yet every time I looked behind us, the forest seemed different, denser, darker, like it had shifted while we weren't watching. I mentioned it quietly and John laughed, shaking his head. "You're imagining things," he said. But I could see the hesitation in his eyes, a small flicker of unease that betrayed his words. It was on the second turn that we started hearing the whispers. At first just faint, almost like wind brushing through leaves. But the pattern was deliberate, not random. A soft sighing, a shifting sound, almost like someone talking quietly to themselves. I stopped and held my breath, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above the whispering of the wind. Mara froze, head tilted, listening. "I think, yes," she said softly. Her voice was cautious, wary. "It's coming from over there." She pointed toward a cluster of pines that looked no different from any other, but my skin prickled as I followed her gaze. We moved closer, careful, trying not to make sudden noise. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to twist, stretch, and shift in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The whispers grew slightly louder as we approached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that they were not just random sounds. They were intentional. Someone or something was out there, moving among the trees, keeping its distance but keeping pace with us. Eli stopped suddenly. "I'm telling you this isn't right," he said, his voice trembling. "We should go back, something watching us." John waved him off, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. I felt it too, the prickling sense that we were being observed, evaluated, and measured. My heartbeat sped up despite my efforts to breathe slowly. The whispers continued, soft and patient, following us, always just at the edge of hearing. We turned back toward the clearing. I thought the fire would make us feel safer, would anchor us in some sense of reality. But when we arrived, the clearing seemed different. The fire had dimmed, not because the wind had died down, but because the shadows around it had thickened. The forest felt closer now, pressing in, narrowing the space between the trees as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. That night sleep was almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw movement in the corner of my vision, shapes that shifted just beyond perception. The whispers persisted, soft, almost comforting at first, but then edging into menace. I could hear them more clearly as the fire flickered low. Sighs, soft footsteps, low exhalations, impossible to pinpoint, impossible to escape. Mara refused to sleep outside the tent. She curled up with her knees to her chest, whispering over and over that we needed to leave. I wanted to reassure her, to say it was nothing, that tomorrow we would hike out and forget this place. But I couldn't. The forest had already begun to invade our minds. Its quiet patience was exhausting. Its silence was louder than any scream. By the time I finally drifted into a restless half-sleep, I felt it. Eyes following me from the edge of the clearing, invisible yet present. A slow, deliberate observation that seemed to anticipate my movements. My imagination tried to convince me it was a trick of the dark, a combination of fatigue and the unfamiliar forest sounds. But deep in my gut, I knew it was real. When I woke again, the whispers were gone, but the sense of being watched remained. a subtle, persistent pressure at the edge of awareness. The forest was quiet now, but it had left its mark, and I knew the moment we stepped beyond the clearing, we would feel it again. I didn't know what was following us, or if it was following us at all, but I knew one thing: we were no longer just visitors in the forest. We had become participants, and whatever waited in the trees, it had already begun to learn us. The light was fading fast. What had started as a soft, golden sunset now bled into gray, and the forest swallowed everything in a dim, uneven shadow. The clearing we had called our camp was no longer comforting. It felt smaller, tighter, pressed in by the towering trees that seemed older and closer than before. I had spent most of the day half watching the tree line, imagining movement where there was none. But now, as dusk settled, I realized the forest didn't need imagination. The movement was real. It started subtly. I caught a flicker out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't match a branch or a log, something that moved against the natural lines of the trees. I blinked, tried to steady my vision, and told myself it was a trick of the fading light. But then it happened again, just beyond the reach of our small fire. A dark shape shifted and melted back into the shadows. Not a person, not an animal, but something unmistakably deliberate, something that belonged to the dark. I froze, heart beating so loudly I thought Mara might hear it over the soft crackle of the fire. "Did you see that?" I whispered. My voice was tight, strained, but she glanced toward me and shook her head, biting her lip. John laughed a little too quickly, trying to shake off the tension. "It's just the light, okay? Shadows playing tricks. You're exhausted." Exhausted. That word hovered in my mind like a thin veil. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been on edge for too long. But it wasn't exhaustion, I knew. It was something else, something patient and deliberate. My eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, scanning every dark crevice, every hollow space between trunks. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone in the watching. Eli, who had been silent most of the day, spoke up in a low voice. "I saw it too," he said. His eyes were wide, darting between the trees and our small circle of firelight. Mara and John both turned toward him, but he didn't elaborate, only shrugged. "It moved, I don't know. Something just shifted, over there." He pointed toward a patch of trees on the far side of the clearing, where darkness pooled like ink. We all watched, silence stretching between us, broken only by the faint snap of a branch somewhere deep in the woods. My stomach tightened. I could feel a kind of pressure in the air, subtle, insistent, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how we would react. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it's an animal," I suggested, though even I didn't believe it. There were no rustlings of paws, no calls or cries. The shape didn't run or scuttle. It shifted and disappeared, then appeared again, just beyond the firelight, as if testing us, gauging our reactions. Mara leaned closer, her face pale in the firelight. "It's too precise," she said, barely above a whisper. "Animals don't move like that." Her eyes flicked toward Eli, and I noticed a flicker of fear in them. Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten even more. We were all starting to feel the same thing. The forest had a rhythm we didn't understand, a patience we weren't prepared for. The shadows grew longer as the sun dipped completely below the horizon. The fire's glow could barely reach the edges of the clearing, and the movement in the darkness became bolder. I saw a shape again, thin, tall, and impossibly still. One moment it was behind a tree, the next it appeared a little closer, always keeping just beyond reach. Every instinct in me screamed to run. But something rooted me in place. Curiosity, fear, and disbelief tangled together, refusing to let me move. John stood, packing a little, trying to regain some sense of control. "It's nothing," he muttered, more to himself than to us. But even as he spoke, I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe it either, but he was scared. We all were. The forest had started to erode that easy trust we'd carried into the day, and now doubt was creeping in, gnawing at us. I caught myself glancing at Mara, at Eli, at John, wondering if anyone else could feel the same way I did. I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat. What if I imagined it? What if speaking about it made it real? My mind raced, but the shadows outside the firelight remained, patient and deliberate, watching us as intently as we tried to watch them. The night deepened, and with it, the shapes began to move in ways that felt impossible. I would see a shadow shift along one edge of the clearing, only to glance away for a second and find it mirrored on the opposite side. It wasn't moving like an animal or a person. It moved like the forest itself was bending, folding around us, testing us, learning us. My throat tightened. My pulse thumped in my ears, and yet I didn't move. I couldn't move. Eli finally spoke again. "We should leave," he said softly. "Tonight, now." His voice quavered, but there was a hard edge to it, a resolve. Mara nodded, eyes still fixed on the tree line. John hesitated, glancing toward the fire, trying to light some courage, but the shadows seemed to mock him, always just out of reach. We gathered our things quietly, the fire reduced to smoldering embers, and I noticed how every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs, even our own breaths felt intrusive. Every movement drew attention. Every pause made the forest press closer. I could feel the shapes watching, tracking, anticipating. And then I saw something I can't explain. A shape, not quite human, not quite animal, glided across the far side of the clearing. Just for a second, I thought it was a trick of the dying light. But when I blinked, it was still there, only now closer, just outside the firelight, a silhouette that didn't belong. I couldn't breathe. My body wanted to run, to scream, but my mind froze, trapped between disbelief and terror. Mara whispered my name, soft and shaky. "Do you see it?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. Her hand found mine, and we clutched each other, silently acknowledging the fear that had gripped us all. The forest was no longer just trees and shadows. It was alive, watching, and patient. We stayed that way until darkness fully settled, until the fire was almost nothing more than a faint glow. We didn't sleep. None of us could. Every sound, every shift in the shadows kept us alert, tense, waiting for something that might never come, or might come from anywhere at any moment. The trust we had carried with us, the easy friendship and laughter, had begun to erode. We watched each other more closely than the forest now, reading movements and expressions for signs of panic or irrational fear. By the time the first faint hint of moonlight began to creep through the treetops, I realized we were exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical fatigue. Our minds had been stretched thin, strained by the quiet, deliberate presence in the darkness. The forest had started to reshape us, bending our perceptions, eroding certainty, leaving only the taut awareness that we were not alone. I lay awake in my tent that night, listening to the whispers of leaves and the soft crackle of dying embers, and I understood something I hadn't before. The shadows weren't random. They weren't illusions. They were aware. And the moment we stepped into the clearing, they had noticed us. They were learning us, marking us, and waiting for the right moment to move closer. Sleep finally came in short, shallow bursts, and even then I was aware of shapes moving beyond the edge of the firelight, of eyes that seemed to follow us as we moved. When morning arrived, it would not bring relief. The forest had claimed our fear, and it would carry it with us, shaping every step we took, every decision we made. We left the clearing at first light, each step deliberate, cautious, as if the forest itself could sense our hesitation. The trail ahead seemed familiar at first, the worn path we had used the day before, but almost immediately something felt wrong. The trees shifted, or maybe it was our perception, but the path seemed narrower, twisted differently, leading us past landmarks that hadn't been there before. A fallen log that I remembered crossing yesterday had vanished, replaced by a tangle of roots and underbrush. Eli was the first to notice. "Wait, this isn't right," he said, voice tight. His eyes scanned the forest, tracking the familiar shapes that had once guided us. "We should be past this clearing by now. We shouldn't be seeing those rocks." I nodded, feeling a shiver creep up my spine. Mara and John exchanged uneasy glances. The sense of being watched had returned with the same subtle pressure that had haunted us the night before, but now it felt heavier, closer, almost like the forest itself had leaned in. We tried to follow the trail, but it twisted unnaturally. One turn led to another that looked like the first, the trees stretching in ways that seemed impossible. Every landmark we remembered shifted or disappeared entirely, as if the forest was reshaping itself while we walked. I felt my stomach tighten, a cold knot of fear winding deeper with every step. Maybe we took a wrong turn, John suggested, his voice wavering despite his attempt at calm. It happens. We'll get back on track. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe in rational explanations, in maps and memory, but the forest refused to yield. The more we walked, the less familiar it became. A rock I had stepped over yesterday was gone. A fallen branch appeared where nothing had been. The trail seemed endless, looping back on itself in ways that made no sense. I felt disoriented, though I had always been good with directions. Something about this place defied logic, patience, and reason. Mara was trembling. "We shouldn't have come this far," she said softly. Her voice broke, though she tried to hide it. "We should turn back, even if it means retracing our steps." "We are trying," I whispered. But even as I said it, I realized we were. The forest had stopped being a place we could navigate. Every path we took led us deeper, not out, as if it were determined to keep us inside its darkness. The first disappearance was subtle. Eli, who had been walking slightly ahead, stopped abruptly, his head tilting to one side. I heard something," he murmured, almost to himself. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft crunch of our boots. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. Not a step away, gone. The space where he had been walking moments before was empty, just the faint outline of his bootprints fading in the soil. "Eli," I called, my voice tight, shaking. Mara grabbed my arm, her hand cold. Don't go looking alone," she whispered. John and I frantically scanned the forest, our eyes straining against the shadows and shifting light. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except the wind in the branches, yet I felt the same patient pressure from the darkness, almost like a presence acknowledging that one of us had vanished. We called his name again and again, our voices hollow, fading into the strange, oppressive quiet of the forest. But Eli didn't answer. He was just gone, and with his absence the forest seemed to grow even darker, more patient, more aware of our fear. Mara's panic rose quickly after that. She clutched my arm and refused to move ahead. "We need to stop," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to stay put until morning, or we'll all disappear." I wanted to argue, to suggest a rational plan, but deep down, I knew she was right. The forest was no longer something we could outpace or reason with. It was aware of us, learning us, anticipating us. Every step we took was a step deeper into its patience. We decided to circle back toward the last landmark we recognized. But the path twisted again. Every turn seemed to lead to the same place, or a place that looked almost like it. Rocks and fallen trees shifted positions. Trees leaned in ways that made familiar openings vanish. The trail mocked us. My pulse thrummed in my ears. I felt disoriented, dizzy, as if the forest itself were pressing against my mind, bending perception, twisting memory. Then Mara vanished. She had paused to examine something, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, or what would have been firelight if it were still evening. One moment she was there, the next, gone. I felt the cold knot of fear tighten into something sharper, almost physical. I called her name, my voice cracking. John and I searched frantically, but the forest refused to reveal her. The shadows seemed to stretch, elongate, folding around us in impossible ways. I could see movement in the corners of my vision, shapes gliding silently behind the trees. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the forest itself had gripped them. The air was thick, humid, and impossibly still, carrying the faintest echo of footsteps, ours, and yet not ours, following us, matching our pace, anticipating us. I tried to stay calm, tried to focus on John, who was pale and trembling beside me. "We have to keep moving," I whispered. "We can't stop." But every step took us deeper into a labyrinth the forest had built for us alone. Familiar paths looped back, opening into areas we had already passed. Twisted trees formed corridors that led us in circles. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch felt like a deliberate signal. You are not leaving. The night fell fully and the forest seemed to close in. Shadows merged and shifted, forming shapes that mimicked human silhouettes, stretching taller, thinner, impossible. I could hear breathing where no one was, soft and steady, just beyond perception. My mind teetered on the edge of panic, trying to reconcile what I saw with what I knew was possible. Then John disappeared. I turned a corner too quickly and he was gone. One moment he was beside me, the next the space was empty, the faint outline of his footprints swallowed by the forest floor. I called out, my voice high and breaking, but there was no answer. Only the forest, patient and deliberate, watching me. I realized then that the forest had learned our movements. It had watched our panic, our hesitation, our fear, and it had responded by taking them, one by one, leaving me alone with the oppressive darkness and the twisting, impossible paths that led nowhere. I stumbled forward, calling their names into the suffocating silence, but the forest offered no guidance, no answers. Only shadow and pressure, the sense that something waited just beyond sight, knowing, patient, deliberate. Hours or maybe minutes, time had lost meaning, passed in a haze of disorientation and dread. The path twisted endlessly, opening into familiar clearings that weren't familiar at all. I tried to follow footprints, tried to mark the trail, but the forest erased everything. Even memory became unreliable. I doubted whether I had ever seen those trees before, or if the forest had rearranged itself to mock me. By the time I finally collapsed against a tree, shivering and exhausted, I understood the cruel truth. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and it had been patient for centuries, waiting for travelers like us, curious, confident, unafraid, until our fear became its instrument. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the quiet, imagining the shapes that moved just beyond vision. I can't know how long I wandered afterward, following paths that led only deeper into the maze of trunks and shadows. Eli, Mara, John, I don't know where they are, and I fear I never will. The forest had claimed them one by one, teaching me a lesson I could never unlearn. It watches, it waits, and those who enter its depths are never the same. When I finally rest, when I close my eyes, I feel it. Eyes in the dark, patient, deliberate, marking my every move, waiting for the next misstep. The trail ends, always. We drove in silence for most of the afternoon. The car windows rolled up against the cold air that smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. The forest stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, trees thick and close together, their branches tangled overhead so that the sun barely reached the ground. Even before we saw it, I felt the presence of the cabin, waiting, patient, as if it had been expecting us. Mara, sitting beside me, hummed softly to herself, trying to mask her unease. I knew she felt it too, the way the forest seemed to tighten around the road, pressing in, darkening as we drove deeper. Every mile took us further from familiarity, further from the world we knew. And yet we had come willingly, seeking quiet, isolation, the kind of retreat that promised escape from city noise and responsibilities. When the cabin finally came into view, it was exactly as the listing had promised. Small, rustic, perched at the edge of a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The paint was faded, peeling in places, the roof weathered and sagging slightly. A single chimney rose from one end, dark against the late afternoon sky. The windows reflected the forest like black mirrors, offering no glimpse of the interior. We parked on the uneven gravel, the car crunching softly beneath the tires. I stepped out first, stretching my legs, feeling the cold bite at my skin. Mara followed, pulling her jacket tighter, scanning the trees nervously. "It's quiet," she said, her voice low. Her eyes lingered on the forest beyond the clearing, the shadows already deepening as the sun began its slow descent. Too quiet. I nodded, though I didn't want to voice the same thought. Quiet can be comforting, or it can be the first sign of something waiting, unseen, just beyond reach. We walked up the small wooden steps to the cabin door, its surface rough under my fingers. The key turned easily in the lock and the door creaked open, exhaling a scent of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the floor creaked underfoot, and a stone fireplace dominated the main room. A thin layer of dust covered the furniture, though it looked as though someone had been careful to keep the space intact. A dining table sat near the window, and a small kitchen nook lay beyond, untouched. The air was heavy, almost thick, as if the cabin itself breathed slowly and deliberately. "I like it," Mara said, though her voice lacked conviction. She moved toward the window, peering into the forest. "It's peaceful." I didn't answer right away. There was a stillness here that felt different from the quiet of the forest outside. The silence wasn't just absence of sound. It was full, almost solid, pressing against the edges of thought. I could feel it crawling along my skin, settling in the small of my back, whispering at the edges of my mind. We unpacked quickly, trying to distract ourselves, filling the space with movement and noise. Boxes of clothes, bags of food, blankets. We tried to make the cabin feel lived in, as if by doing so we could push back against the creeping awareness that something about this place wasn't right. As we moved through the cabin, I found myself noticing details I hadn't at first. Faint scratches in the wood near the doorway, almost like someone had dragged their nails along it. A small, dark stain on the floor near the fireplace, half hidden beneath the rug. The odd placement of furniture, as if someone had been precise about where everything belonged. Mara was humming again, trying to maintain a rhythm, a sense of normalcy, but I could see her glancing repeatedly toward the windows, toward the shadows just beyond the glass. By the time we lit a fire in the fireplace, the sun had dipped low, leaving the forest in a half-light, gray and heavy. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, stretching toward the walls and ceiling. The flames flickered softly, casting dancing shapes that seemed alive. I could feel their movement, the way the light bent and twisted against the furniture, and it made my stomach tighten. Mara sat on the couch, blanket around her shoulders, sipping hot tea. "Do you think the stories are true?" she asked quietly, as though speaking aloud might summon the answer. "The listing said the previous occupant disappeared," I replied slowly. "No one really knows what happened, just gone, left everything behind. It's the kind of story that makes you second-guess staying here, I guess." She nodded, staring into the fire. "It feels like they're still here, like watching." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and I felt it too, the subtle pressure, the sensation of presence, patient, deliberate waiting. We tried to laugh it off, to shake the unease that had settled over us, but it lingered. The cabin wasn't just a place. It was a container for the past, for memories that weren't ours, for absence that felt heavier than presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside seemed amplified, charged with intent. Later, I explored the small bedroom. The bed was neatly made, sheets crisp and cold to the touch. A dresser stood against one wall, drawers closed tight. I opened them slowly, half expecting to find something, anything, that would explain the stories. But they were empty, save for a faint smell of old wood and the lingering scent of someone long gone. In the corner of the room, near the window, I noticed a small journal, its leather cover worn, pages yellowed. I picked it up, running my fingers over the surface. There was a name written inside the front cover, the handwriting delicate, precise, someone who had lived here before. And then I read the first line. "They are always watching, even when the forest is silent. I can feel them in the corners of my mind." I dropped the journal immediately, my pulse quickening. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. Mara called my name softly, asking if I had found something. I forced a calm laugh, brushing it off as imagination, but deep down I knew that the words mirrored exactly the sense of pressure, the patient presence I had been feeling since we arrived. Night fell fully, and the forest beyond the windows became a black wall, impenetrable, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. We ate a simple dinner, trying to keep our voices steady, to fill the cabin with ordinary sound. But every time we paused, the quiet returned with weight, pressing in around us, carrying the echo of someone or something that had lived here before. Before bed, I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that security didn't matter here. The cabin had its own rules, its own awareness. And as I lay down, listening to Mara's soft breathing beside me, I realized that the stories weren't just tales. They were warnings. The last thought before sleep took me was the journal, those words echoing in my mind. They are always watching. And I felt in the deepest part of my gut that whoever, or whatever, had once lived here was not entirely gone. The next morning, the cabin felt different, not because the sunlight had changed, though it barely reached the forest floor, but because the air inside seemed heavier. Mara and I moved through the rooms more cautiously, our steps quieter than usual, as if even our presence might disturb something that had been waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin had noticed us, remembered our arrival, and was now watching, patient, deliberate. It was while exploring the back corner of the main room that I first noticed the door. Small, old, wooden, unlike the other interior doors. Its paint was flacking, revealing gray wood beneath. A rusty lock held it shut, and it had clearly not been opened in years. Mara hovered behind me, shifting uneasily. "Have you noticed this before?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head. "No, I didn't even see it yesterday." The door felt alive somehow, heavy with history. I pressed my hand against it, and the wood was rough, cold under my palm. I could almost feel the weight of time pressing back, as if the cabin itself was resisting my curiosity. And yet, something drew me in, an insistence in my chest that I couldn't ignore. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was old, corroded, stubborn. I glanced at Mara. She chewed her lower lip, eyes wide. "Maybe we shouldn't," she whispered. But curiosity won, as it often does. I examined the lock, fiddling with the small latch, trying not to notice the tiny hairs raising along my arms. The air around the door felt thicker, denser, almost as if it were breathing slowly and deliberately. And then, finally, it gave way with a reluctant click. The door swung open into darkness, revealing a small room that smelled faintly of mold and old paper. The light from the main room barely reached the far corner, leaving the space shrouded in shadow. Dust hung in the air, particles moving lazily like tiny specters. I stepped inside, Mara close behind, and my foot kicked something hard. A box. We bent to examine it. Inside were stacks of yellowed newspapers, brittle and curling at the edges. I picked up the top one and unfolded it carefully. The headline screamed quietly at me. "Another hiker vanishes in Blackpine Forest." My heart stuttered, even though the words themselves were mundane, printed decades ago in ink that had faded but never quite disappeared. Mara leaned over my shoulder, reading with me. The article described a young man who had disappeared while hiking alone, leaving no trace except his abandoned pack. There were photographs of the forest, strangely familiar, though I couldn't place the exact locations. A sense of déjà vu washed over me, chilling in its subtlety. More clippings followed, all detailing disappearances, missing persons, unexplained vanishings in the same area. Some were from decades ago, others seemed more recent, though the yellowed paper suggested otherwise. Each story was similar. A hiker or camper goes into the woods and never returns. Sometimes belongings were found, sometimes not. Always the forest remained silent, indifferent. I felt my stomach tighten. Mara's hand found mine, small and clammy. This is why the listing mentioned the previous occupant," she said softly. "They must have seen all this. Maybe they disappeared too." I nodded, swallowing hard. My mind traced the possibilities, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the occupant had been studying the patterns, the vanishings, trying to find logic where none existed. Or maybe the forest had claimed them, as it had claimed so many before. The thought made my chest constrict, the air around me feeling suddenly heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. We continued to explore the room, carefully handling the clippings. A small notebook lay in the corner, its pages filled with neat handwriting, diagrams of the forest, maps with paths marked and crossed out. I scanned the entries, notes about sounds in the night, fleeting shadows, strange rustlings, and the feeling of being followed. Every word seemed to pulse with the fear and obsession of someone who had lived here before, trapped in their own investigation. Mara shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's like they were trying to warn anyone who came here," she murmured. "Like they knew we'd find this room." I wanted to reassure her, to say it was just a coincidence, a collection of old stories that had nothing to do with us. But even as I opened my mouth, the air shifted. A soft creak echoed from the hallway outside the room, barely perceptible, but enough to make my blood run cold. I froze. Mara did too. We listened. Footsteps, or perhaps something heavier, deliberate, packing slowly in the hall. I tried to reason it. Maybe the floorboards had settled, the wind shifting the structure. But a part of me, the part that had felt the cabin watching since the moment we arrived, whispered that it was something else, something aware. I closed the box of newspapers slowly, careful not to make a sound. The room felt smaller now, the shadows deeper. The pressure in the air pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Mara reached for my hand again, gripping tightly. "We should leave it," she whispered. "Close it up. Maybe some things are meant to stay hidden." I wanted to argue, wanted to investigate further, but the unease had settled firmly in my gut. We carefully replaced the lid on the box and stepped back, letting the door swing closed. The rusty lock clicked shut again, and the room fell silent, returning to its patient, secretive darkness. We retreated to the main room, trying to fill the silence with mundane tasks, tidying, unpacking, preparing breakfast. But the feeling of the locked room lingered. Every creak of the floorboards, every subtle draft, reminded me that the room existed, full of history, full of warnings. The forest beyond the windows pressed in silently, indifferent waiting. Later, I found myself returning to the doorway, almost unconsciously. I pressed my hand against the wood, feeling the cold roughness, the weight of memory and absence behind it. For a brief moment, I imagined the occupant standing there, watching us, perhaps knowing we would come, perhaps warning us in their own silent, desperate way. Mara noticed my hesitation. "Don't," she said firmly, placing her hand on my shoulder. "Don't let it get inside your mind. That's what it wants, to make us second guess, to make us fear." I nodded, though I knew she was right. Fear was creeping in, subtle, patient, persistent. It wasn't a scream or a shadow darting across the room. It was the quiet insistence that we were not alone, that we were intruding into something older, deeper, more deliberate than us. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the locked room. The stories in the clippings, the notebook, the maps, they were evidence of someone who had been here before us, consumed by curiosity, maybe by obsession, maybe by the forest itself. The wind rattled the cabin gently, like soft footsteps circling, and I felt the weight of being watched, of history pressing down, of presence lingering just beyond sight. I stared at the ceiling, listening to Mara's breathing, trying to anchor myself in something real, something tangible. But in the corner of my mind, the locked room waited, patient, silent, full of stories, full of warnings, full of secrets that may have cost someone their life. And I knew, deep down, that we had opened the first door into something much larger, something patient and deliberate, that had been waiting for us to arrive. Night had settled over the cabin like a thick blanket, pressing down on the roof and walls, making the air feel heavier, slower. I lay awake beside Mara, listening to her breathing, soft and steady, trying to anchor myself to something real. But the forest outside was alive in a way I had not noticed during the day. Every branch that tapped against the window, every rustle of leaves against the cabin, sounded deliberate, almost choreographed. I told myself it was just the wind or a small animal brushing past the trees, but the unease in my chest refused to be quieted. I rolled onto my side, staring at the ceiling, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The shadows pooled and shifted along the walls, flickering like restless thoughts. And then I heard it, a single, deliberate creak of the floorboards outside our bedroom door. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another creak, this time closer, deliberate, slow, step after step, as though someone or something was packing just beyond the wall. The sound didn't echo like footsteps in a house. It carried weight, a patience that made my pulse spike. "Mara," I whispered, not wanting to startle her too much. She stirred, half asleep, and murmured my name. "Did you hear that?" I asked softly. She nodded, eyes wide in the dark. "It's probably just the cabin," she whispered back. "Old wood settling the wind." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to convince myself that there was a rational explanation, that our minds were twisting ordinary sounds into something sinister because of the stories, because of the locked room we had found earlier. But every step felt intentional, measured, like a visitor who knew we were listening. We lay there trying to pretend we were asleep, letting the sound drift past, but it didn't. The steps slowed, paused, then moved again, circling the bedroom door. My fingers itched to grab something, to open the door and confront the emptiness I knew would be there. But I stayed still, paralyzed by fear and curiosity at once. Maybe someone else is in the cabin," Mara said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the tension she was trying to mask. I shook my head. No one could have gotten in. We locked the doors, the windows, everything. It has to be something else. Her eyes searched mine, asking for reassurance I didn't have. "Something else," she repeated softly. "Yes," I whispered. "I don't know what, but I feel like the cabin itself is aware, like it's moving around us." The next steps were slower, almost hesitant. I imagined the shadow of a figure pressing against the far wall, elongated and unreal in the flickering light from the fireplace we had left burning in the main room earlier. The firelight stretched thin across the floorboards, creating shapes that weren't shapes, figures that weren't figures, but my mind tried desperately to assign intention to them. I remembered the journal we had seen in the locked room, the words of the previous occupant. "They are always watching, even when the forest is silent." I can feel them in the corners of my mind. The thought curled cold in my chest. What had they felt here, alone, in this same darkness? How long had the pressure been waiting for someone to arrive? The footsteps stopped abruptly, as though whatever had been moving sensed that we were awake. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. My ears strained for the next sound, for any sign of movement, but there was only the subtle groan of the cabin settling, the gentle whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls. I reached for Mara's hand under the blanket. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. I tried to whisper comfort, though my own voice sounded hollow in the heavy air. "It's okay. Probably just the floorboards, that's all." She didn't respond, but her grip tightened around mine. I felt a pulse of tension ripple through the room, a quiet anticipation, as though the cabin itself was listening, waiting for us to make a sound. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost its shape in the darkness. Then a faint scratching sound joined the quiet, a soft, deliberate scrape along the floor outside the bedroom door. My throat tightened. I wanted to close my eyes, to pretend none of it existed, but I couldn't. I felt trapped between disbelief and the creeping certainty that we were not alone. Mara whispered, I think it's trying to communicate." I swallowed hard. "Communicate with us?" She nodded slightly, eyes wide in the dim firelight. "Or trying to warn us, something wants us to notice." I didn't know what to say. Every rational explanation had already failed to quiet the fear. Every logical thought had been swallowed by the weight of the cabin, by the way the darkness seemed to pulse and breathe around us. The steps moved again, this time more deliberate, packing slowly back and forth. I could imagine them, each one calculated, patient, like a predator testing its prey. And in my mind, I could see shadows stretching along the hallway, shapes forming and dissolving at the edges of vision. I tried to focus on my breathing in and out, slow and steady. Mara whispered encouragement, the sound barely audible. We clung to each other, grounding ourselves in touch and presence, though the pressure around us continued to build. The cabin was alive, aware, and it had begun its game. Then, almost imperceptibly, the footsteps changed. They paused, then moved toward the locked room. My pulse raced. That room had been sealed for years, holding stories, warnings, evidence of disappearances. And now, whatever had been moving through the cabin was drawn to it. I wanted to stop it, to intervene, but I felt frozen, a part of me unwilling to see what might lie beyond the door. Mara squeezed my hand. "We can't ignore it," she whispered. "We have to see." I shook my head. "No, not yet, not until we understand it." The steps receded slowly, moving back into the shadows of the hall. The tension didn't leave with them. It lingered, thick and suffocating. We lay in silence, listening to our own hearts, trying to convince ourselves that the cabin had returned to stillness. But the weight of it pressed in, patient, deliberate, always watching. I thought of the previous occupant again, alone in this same room, hearing the same sounds, feeling the same pressure, the same unseen presence. They had left clues, notes, warnings, but nothing had prepared us for the patience of whatever moved here, for the slow, deliberate intrusion into our night. Hours passed in uneasy half-sleep. Every small creak, every sigh of the cabin made me jump, made Mara stir. The footsteps didn't return in the same way, but their memory haunted every shadow. Every time the darkness shifted, I imagined them moving just beyond the edges of vision, waiting for the moment we looked away or let our guard down. By the time dawn began to seep into the windows, pale and weak, we were exhausted, restless, and quietly terrified. The cabin had made its presence known without a single scream, without a single shadow crossing our path fully. And yet the pressure, the awareness, the creeping sense of observation, it lingered. We didn't speak much that morning, both of us wary, exhausted, and aware that the locked room still waited in the corner, full of stories, of warnings, of history. Whatever had paced the hall, whatever had moved outside our room, it had retreated only because it chose to, not because it had to. I knew deep down that the cabin had not released us from its attention. It was patient, deliberate, and it would wait. And so would we, trapped in the knowledge that some things could not be explained, only endured as shadows stretched long and patient along the walls, carrying history, fear, and something older than ourselves. I woke to the faintest hint of light slipping through the cabin windows, though it wasn't the soft warmth of sunrise I expected. The forest outside was still shrouded in shadows, mist curling between the trees, thick and deliberate, as if the night had decided to linger. I turned toward Mara, expecting to see her curled up beside me, her hand finding mine as usual, but the bed was empty. Panic threaded through me slowly, a quiet, crawling dread. I called her name softly, voice barely above a whisper, hoping it was just a sleepwalking moment or that she had gone to the bathroom. But the cabin answered only with silence, deep and patient, as though listening, waiting for me to notice that something was wrong. I got out of bed carefully, feet touching the cold floor. Every step I took echoed in the empty space, loud in the quiet. And I felt a tightening in my chest as I moved through the main room. The fire we had left burning the night before was long dead, leaving the room gray and muted, every shadow stretching and twisting unnaturally in the dim light. "Mara," I called again, my voice tremulous. No reply. I moved toward the door, hoping she had simply wandered into another room, but the hallway was empty, the room silent. Then I noticed the first sign that something had changed, something deliberate, something that wasn't there before. The walls, they had been marked, scratched, carved, etched in ways that made my stomach knot. Letters, words, almost illegible in their jaggedness. "You should not be here." My fingers itched to touch the wall, but I recoiled, afraid that contact might make it worse, might summon something deeper from the darkness. The words were raw, desperate, urgent. They didn't feel human, and yet they must have been. Who else could have been here in the dead of night? I moved slowly down the hall, trying to rationalize. Maybe the previous occupant had returned, or someone had broken in, but the doors and windows were locked, untouched, and the forest outside still loomed with silent patience. I felt the tension coiling in my chest, every nerve alive with anticipation, every shadow whispering possibilities. Another wall, another message. This one more frantic. The morning does not arrive. The letters were deeper, gouged into the wood as if someone or something had used the last of their strength to carve them. My mind raced. Was this a warning, a taunt, or a record of the previous occupant's fear, somehow alive again, echoing through the cabin walls? I felt Mara's presence behind me, or the memory of it. I imagined her walking with me through the hall, guiding me, telling me not to panic, not to give in. But the memory only made me ache. She was gone. The bed, the rooms, even the air beside me seemed to insist that she had never been there at all. I moved cautiously into the main room, scanning every corner. The kitchen, the living area, every familiar object now felt alien. Shadows pooled in corners, stretched along the walls, and I could almost hear them breathing, slow and deliberate. I touched the table lightly, trying to reassure myself that I was still grounded in reality. I was. And yet, the unease pressed in, like a weight I could not lift. Then I noticed the notebook from the locked room. It lay open on the table, pages rustling as if caught in a draft, though no breeze stirred. I approached it cautiously. The handwriting inside was not the same as before. Trembling letters scrawled across the page, newer, urgent. "You are alone. The morning will not come." My pulse throbbed painfully in my temples. I wanted to laugh, to shake my head and say it was a trick, a hallucination born of too many hours of fear. But the air in the cabin, heavy and expectant, refused my rational mind. Every sound, the settling of the wood, the faint groan of the roof, made the warnings feel alive, as though the cabin itself were speaking. I called her name again, louder this time, desperation rising. "Mara!" My voice seemed swallowed instantly, absorbed into the walls, leaving me with only my own fear. I began to move methodically through the rooms, checking closets, corners, even the space under the furniture. Each place was empty, but every surface carried the evidence of something unseen. Scratches, marks, symbols etched in haste and care alike. Some were coherent, some chaotic, a jumble of letters and shapes that made no sense but felt deliberate. I paused in the hallway, listening. Nothing. And yet I could feel it, the pressure, the weight of observation. I imagined shadows moving just beyond sight, patient and deliberate, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to understand that the cabin had chosen to trap us in this slow, endless twilight. I remembered the previous night, the footsteps circling outside our bedroom. I remembered the locked room and the stacks of newspapers describing disappearances. And now this, Mara gone, the walls speaking in words that burned into my mind. The cabin had escalated its game. It was no longer just observing. It was manipulating, shaping reality around me, bending time and expectation until I could not trust either. I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the wall. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, a frantic drum in the hollow silence. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was sleep deprivation, paranoia, the culmination of every strange thing we had seen in the last 24 hours. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had occupied this cabin before us, whatever lingered in these walls, was patient, deliberate, and aware. Hours or maybe minutes passed. I don't know how long I remained there, pressed to the wall, staring at the cryptic messages. The cabin seemed to stretch time, elongate it, until even the concept of morning became meaningless. And then, faintly, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye, shadows pooling, stretching, as if the room itself were breathing, alive and patient. I called out once more, my voice hoarse. "Mara, where are you?" The sound felt small, insignificant, swallowed instantly by the dark. There was no reply, only the subtle echo of my own fear, bouncing back at me from every surface. I tried to leave, tried to step toward the front door, but the hall seemed to twist, the floorboards uneven, subtly, impossibly. I wasn't walking straight. I was veering, drifting, as though the cabin itself had reconfigured around me. Panic rose, but I held it at bay, letting calm determination anchor me. If the cabin wanted to trap me, I had to remain conscious, aware, deliberate. And then I saw it, scrawled across the wall beside the door, a single phrase that made my blood turn cold. The morning never comes. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but the words were a cage, a lock in my mind as well as in the wood. The air felt thick, almost viscous, pressing down on me from all sides. And in that moment I understood. The cabin didn't need to hurt me or Mara or anyone. Its power lay in the subtle, creeping certainty that we were alone, lost, suspended in a night that would not end. I sank to the floor again, shivering, trying to breathe steadily to rationalize. But rational thought had abandoned me long ago. The messages were real, the absence was real, the presence in the shadows was real. And the forest outside, patient and silent, waited for us to make a mistake, to move without caution, to acknowledge that the morning might never, in fact, come. I curled into myself, holding the notebook against my chest. The letters, the scratches, the warnings, they were alive in memory now, echoing in my skull. And I knew with an understanding that chilled me more than any shadow ever could that the cabin would wait, patient, deliberate, eternal in its observation. And so I sat there, listening to the silence that wasn't silence at all, feeling the weight of absence, and realizing that the morning, no matter how I wished for it, might never arrive. The forest at night is different. It feels alive, but not in the way a bird or a deer is alive. It moves with patience. It watches. That's the first thing I noticed as we settled around the campfire, the orange glow cutting weakly through the darkness, illuminating the faces of my friends in flickering shadows. We were teenagers then, eager for adventure, for stories that made our hearts beat faster, but never imagining that some stories might not be stories at all. The older kids told us about the legends that clung to these woods like mist, a spectral figure, they said, that followed anyone foolish enough to wander after dark. They called it the Watcher, though none of us had ever seen it. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it didn't need to be seen to be real. I remember the way the firelight danced over their faces, exaggerating features, making eyes wider, shadows deeper. My friend Lucas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered the first story. His voice was low, careful, as though speaking louder might summon the thing he described. "They say it follows you," he said, eyes darting into the dark beyond the fire. "Not right away, not when you're watching, but when you think you're alone, when the forest is quiet and you're walking back to camp after dark." He paused, letting the silence stretch. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath with him. Leaves rustled in the distance, and I felt the pull of imagination, the subtle twist of fear that comes when your mind begins to fill empty spaces with possibilities. "You won't see it clearly," Lucas continued. "Sometimes it's just a shadow, sometimes a shape that disappears if you look directly at it. And the worst part, you'll hear it, footsteps, whispers, breathing, following behind you, always following." I swallowed hard, feeling the tension coil in my chest. I glanced around, noticing how the other kids' faces were lit only by the flickering fire, the shadows seeming to cling to them, twisting and moving in ways the light couldn't hold still. "Come on," another voice Maya's challenged. "It's just a story, old campfire nonsense, right?" But even as she said it, her hand tightened around the small flashlight she held, knuckles white. The forest around us was heavy with darkness, thicker than the night should have been, pressing against the edges of our circle. Lucas shook his head slowly, a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Nope, not nonsense. People disappear here, hikers, campers. Sometimes you find footprints in the morning leading nowhere, like something walked beside them in the night, but mostly nothing, just gone." I felt the hair on my arms rise. I wanted to laugh, to make a joke, to break the spell, but my throat was tight. The wind shifted outside the trees, carrying a faint creak or a snapping twig. My heart jumped. I told myself it was the forest, an animal, a branch. But the story had already settled in, and fear has a way of sharpening ordinary sounds into threats. Lucas leaned closer. If you hear it, don't run. Running only makes it curious. Stay still. Don't let it know you're afraid. And for God's sake, never wander off alone after dark. We all laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension, but even in laughter there was unease. I kept glancing toward the tree line, toward the pitch black that swallowed shapes and distance alike. Every rustle, every sigh of the forest felt like a warning now, a subtle echo of the stories we had just heard. Maya nudged me lightly. Stop staring like that. You're freaking yourself out. I'm not, I muttered, though my voice betrayed me. I was. I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, the way they might sound just behind me, following silently, deliberately unseen. The older kids had brought some candles too, placed them around the fire circle. Their small, weak flames did little to push back the darkness, but they created little pockets of light, little islands of safety in the vast shadow. And that's when I thought I saw it, just a movement beyond the tree line, a fleeting shadow that vanished before I could focus. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, the trees were still. The wind moved. Nothing remained. Did you see that? I whispered, voice trembling slightly. See what? Maya asked, peering at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. I thought, never mind. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. My imagination was alive tonight, feeding on every story, every rustle, every shadow. But the feeling of being watched had taken root in me, patient and slow, like the shadow itself was waiting, just beyond my sight. Lucas took another deep breath and began a new story. This one was about a camper who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only footprints that stopped at the edge of a clearing. They say he walked for hours, Lucas said softly, but no one saw him leave. And in the morning the tracks, they didn't make sense. Some were normal, but others, twisted like someone or something, had walked on the tops of the logs across the stream, never leaving a clear mark. And he was never found. A chill ran down my spine. I imagined the scene vividly, the footprints in the mud, disappearing as if into nothing, the forest closing in, the unseen watcher packing silently behind, observing, patient. Maya shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Stop it, she whispered. It's too much. But we couldn't stop. The stories were feeding something in the air. The forest outside seemed to respond, closing in, listening. Every snapping twig, every distant call of an owl or rustling of leaves sounded deliberate now, like soft footsteps circling our camp. I tried to convince myself it was just the night, that our minds were creating patterns, shapes, and movements where none existed. But the fear was stubborn. It didn't care about reason. It only cared that we felt small, exposed, and observed. Lucas's final story was about the watcher itself. They say it's not a ghost, not quite human, something older, something patient. It doesn't attack. Not at first, it waits, it follows. And if you ever turn to see it, you'll never see it clearly, just movement. Shadows in the corner of your eye, always watching, always walking behind you just out of reach. I imagined it then, the figure, packing silently, patient, deliberate. I imagined it moving behind us in the darkness beyond the firelight, unseen but aware of every small motion, every whispered breath. The fire crackled, throwing shadows into the trees, and for a moment I swore I could see something, moving slowly, deliberately in the space between the trunks. I blinked. It was gone. Maya gasped softly, nudging me. Stop looking, it's nothing, nothing's out there. But I couldn't stop. My eyes traced every shadow, every slight movement of leaves and branches. My pulse quickened, but not in panic, more in anticipation. There was something here, something patient, something waiting for night to fall fully, for the campfire to die, for us to wander away from the safety of the circle. Eventually, the older kids went to their tents, leaving us in the soft, dying glow of the fire. I stayed by the flames, unwilling to look away, unwilling to move too far from the light. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded louder, deliberate. I imagined footsteps echoing just beyond the tree line, slow, measured, following the stories, following us. The night deepened. Shadows pooled between the trees. Mist rose along the forest floor, curling and twisting as though it had its own intent. And I realized then fully with a creeping, patient horror. Some stories are not meant for laughter. Some stories are waiting for witnesses. And once you hear them, you can never unhear the way they make the world around you feel alive and aware. I lay awake that night in my tent, listening to the forest, every sense alert. The stories had been more than words. They were warnings. And somewhere just beyond the reach of the firelight, I felt it. The presence, patient, deliberate, following, waiting, watching. The fire had burned lower than usual that night, flickering weakly against the rising mist. Shadows pooled around our camp like dark water, swallowing everything beyond its reach. We tried to laugh, to tell jokes, but the stories from the night before clung to us like a second skin, too heavy to shake off. I was the first to notice it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection in the wet leaves. But then I saw them, 2 points of faint amber glowing just beyond the tree line. My pulse picked up, my stomach tightening as I tried to rationalize. Probably just a deer, I muttered, though I didn't meet anyone's eyes. Lucas leaned closer, the firelight outlining his face in sharp contrast. Deer don't have eyes that glow like that, he said softly. Not at night, not in that way. I squinted, my breath catching as the 2 points shifted slightly, moving together but independently as though testing the edges of the light. It wasn't fast, not yet. It was patient, deliberate, watching, waiting. Maya grabbed my arm, cold fingers tightening around my wrist. "Do you see that?" she whispered, eyes wide, staring into the darkness. "Yes," I said, barely above a whisper, feeling my voice tremble. "I see it." We all sat frozen, the fire crackling between us, a small, fragile barrier against the blackness. The eyes didn't blink or move erratically. They simply stayed there, staring, fixed on us. And then I noticed more small points of light appearing in the shadows beyond the first pair. Others, many others. A quiet pressure began to settle over us, like the forest itself had leaned in closer. I tried to tell myself it was our imagination, that the stories had done this to us, bending the ordinary into fear. But there was something deliberate in the movement of those eyes, something patient. They weren't scattered randomly like a flock of birds. They were arranged, deliberate in placement, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where we were. "Maybe we should leave," Maya said softly, breaking the tension with the simplest of truths. But even as she spoke, the eyes shifted slightly closer, moving in subtle arcs, circling our camp without haste, patient, silent. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, wanted to call out, but my body refused to obey. Fear had anchored me, leaving only my eyes and my mind alert to every tiny change. The air was thick, heavy, tasting faintly of damp earth and pine, and I realized I could hear it now. Soft rustling, movement among the underbrush, deliberate steps that weren't quite footsteps, yet unmistakably present. Lucas exhaled slowly, breaking the silence. "Okay, someone's here," he said. "Or something, either way. It's not going away." I could only nod, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet the path beyond the camp was swallowed in darkness. We were pinned by the forest itself, or whatever had chosen to watch us tonight. Then the eyes moved again, not closer this time. They stayed just at the edge of our vision, shifting subtly, adjusting. It was watching our reactions, measuring, learning how we responded to fear. The forest seemed alive in a new way, not the calm, indifferent wilderness we'd known in daylight, but a place aware of our every movement, our every thought. I tried to recall the stories Lucas had told, the warnings about not turning to look directly, about staying calm, about patience. And yet I couldn't stop myself. I shifted slightly, just enough to see between the trees, and caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure, tall, unmoving, like a silhouette carved from night itself. It disappeared when I blinked, leaving only the eyes. Maya gasped beside me. "I saw it too," she whispered. Her voice trembled, though she tried to keep it low, controlled. It's watching us." "Yes," I said, voice hoarse. "It is." We sat there for what felt like hours, though I know it could not have been more than minutes. The fire burned lower, our circle of safety shrinking as the shadows pressed closer. The eyes remained just beyond the light, patient and unhurried. Occasionally, one would vanish, only for another to appear elsewhere in the darkness. We were being studied, probed, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I tried to reason again. Perhaps it was a pack of animals, curious and bold. Perhaps some other campers were playing tricks, but the movements were deliberate, precise, coordinated in a way that no animal could manage, no human could replicate. Something older, something patient, was observing, lingering at the edges of perception, testing us. My mind began to wander, imagining the legends, the spectral watcher that followed anyone who strayed too far after dark, and I realized with a creeping chill that this wasn't a story anymore. The tailies had been warnings. We were experiencing the truth behind them, subtle and patient, creeping like mist into our minds. Lucas finally whispered, "Don't move, don't react, don't give it a reason to approach." His voice carried a weight that made me shiver. We understood instinctively. The more we acted, the more we risked drawing attention. The forest seemed to pulse with patience, holding us in place with invisible hands. I kept my gaze fixed on the eyes, counting them silently, trying to make sense of their movement. Sometimes a pair would blink in unison, or vanish entirely, leaving only a lingering sense of being watched from elsewhere. I felt my own heart slow, trying to match the stillness the eyes demanded, trying to become invisible in the smallest way possible. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. I couldn't tell. The forest had its own sense of time, and in its patience it stretched hours, elongating moments into an eternity of tension. And then, as if deciding we had learned enough, the eyes began to fade, retreating into the darkness, leaving only the faintest hints of light between the trees. We exhaled together, relief soft and fragile, though the memory of those eyes lingered, coiling in our minds like smoke. Even as we tried to talk ourselves back to normalcy, the forest whispered, reminding us that it had been watching, and it would continue to watch, even after the eyes had gone. Maya finally stood, voice trembling. Let's get inside before it comes back." We moved slowly to our tents, every step deliberate, careful. Even as I zipped up my sleeping bag and tried to lie down, I could feel the weight of the forest, the memory of those eyes pressing at the edges of my mind. Sleep was hesitant, cautious, interrupted by every sound. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, shadows shifting just beyond the thin fabric of our tents. And in that darkness, I realized a truth that chilled me more than any ghost story. The eyes weren't the worst part. The worst part was the certainty that we had been seen, that someone, or something, was waiting, patient, deliberate, and eternal in its observation. And for the first time, I understood the warning fully. Wandering in the forest after dark was not a choice. It was an invitation. I lay there, listening, waiting, half expecting to see those glowing points again. And somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight, the watcher was moving, silent and patient, its gaze fixed upon us, knowing exactly where we were and exactly how to wait. By the time the first hint of dawn crept into the sky, the fire had long since died, leaving only the gray ash and the faint scent of smoke that hung stubbornly in the damp forest air. Sleep had been fitful, broken by rustling outside the tent, by the faint creak of branches, by the memory of amber eyes glowing beyond the tree line. Every little sound had felt deliberate, measured, as though something had waited all night to test our nerves. When we finally decided to leave, it wasn't out of courage. It was fear, the kind that twists your stomach and leaves your hands shaking even as you try to move with purpose. We packed quietly, each of us stealing glances at the forest, half expecting to see the watcher again, those patient amber eyes following our every motion. The trail we had come in on was familiar in daylight. I thought I remembered it clearly, the bends, the fallen logs, the small clearing where we had pitched the tents. But the moment we stepped onto it, I realized the forest had changed. Or maybe it hadn't changed at all, and it was my own memory that had betrayed me. Paths twisted in ways I didn't remember. Familiar landmarks seemed to move, subtly shifting, like a trick of the light. But more than that, like the forest itself was alive and watching. Every step felt uncertain. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pull away from memory, leading me into angles I didn't recognize. "Which way?" Maya whispered behind me. Her voice trembled, quiet but urgent. I thought it was straight," I said, though doubt gnawed at me. I tried to recall the path step by step, but the trees seemed to crowd in closer, the shadows shifting to obscure the way forward. The forest had become a maze, each familiar tree now strange, each fallen branch a new obstacle. And then I heard it. Not footsteps this time, not rustling, whispering. Soft, indistinct, almost inaudible at first, like the wind passing through dry leaves. But it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, measured, circling around us as we walked. "Do you hear that?" Lucas whispered, stepping closer. His eyes scanned the darkness beyond the faint light of our small flashlights. "It's someone's there." "No," I said quickly. "It's the wind. It has to be." I hated the tremor in my own voice, hated how it betrayed the uncertainty I tried to hide. But the whispers continued, curling around us, rising and falling in the spaces between the trees. They were unintelligible, a rhythm rather than words, but unmistakably deliberate. Every step we took seemed to echo into the darkness, mirrored by the whispers that followed in subtle, untraceable patterns. I started to notice the air changing. The forest smelled different, damp and heavy, carrying an unfamiliar musk, the faint tang of decay that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. The mist that had clung to the ground thickened, curling around our legs like fingers, reluctant to let us move freely. Each of us moved cautiously, hesitant to step too far ahead, too far behind. Every small noise became amplified, the snapping of twigs beneath our feet, the rustle of a bird disturbed by our passage, the whisper of leaves as a light wind passed through. But the whispers we heard were softer, closer, deliberate, following us with a patience that made my chest tighten with fear. I thought I saw movement at the edges of my vision, a flicker between the trees, the shadow of a figure, or maybe the trick of light and mist. But every time I tried to focus, it vanished. Yet the feeling remained. Something was moving just beyond our sight, patient, unhurried, observing every step. Lucas muttered something under his breath, a prayer or a warning. I couldn't tell. Maya clutched my arm, cold and trembling. We tried to stick together, but the forest seemed intent on separating us, bending paths and twisting the landscape until even the trail we had trusted became unrecognizable. I called out once, trying to break the tension, my voice sharp and unsure. "Hello, is anyone there?" Silence answered. Not the kind of silence that is still or peaceful, but a heavy, patient silence that pressed against the ears and lungs alike. The whispers grew softer, teasing at the edges of perception, always close but never near enough to identify. They circled us, weaving through the trees, following every movement. Hours, maybe minutes, I couldn't tell, passed in this haze. The forest was no longer a forest. It was a living thing, patient, deliberate, watching, bending the familiar into something unrecognizable. Every tree seemed to lean in, every shadow seemed to pulse. And through it all, the whispers followed, gentle and cruel, reminding us that we were not alone. Then I noticed the footprints. Small, shallow impressions in the soft earth, not ours, not human, or at least not entirely. They appeared beside our trail, parallel to our steps, then vanished. They moved in ways that made no sense, over roots, across streams, defying logic. And when we tried to follow them, they disappeared entirely, leaving only the mist behind. I felt the first real panic rising, a tightening in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The forest was no longer just dark. It was active, patient, testing us. The watchers, the whispers, the presence were everywhere and nowhere. Every step we took, every choice we made was observed and accounted for. Lucas's voice shook slightly. "We should stay together. Don't split up. That's what it wants." "What wants?" I asked, but I knew the answer even as I spoke. Something waited beyond the trees, patient and deliberate, shaping the forest around us, bending the path, whispering in voices we couldn't understand. It was teaching us caution, fear, awareness, and it was good at it. The mist grew heavier, curling around our legs, our arms, wrapping us in silence and cold. Each movement became difficult, laborious. Every sound seemed amplified, the forest breathing around us, alive with unseen presence. Maya's voice broke the rhythm of whispers. I think I saw it. What, where? Lucas demanded, tense and alert. Between the trees, she whispered. A figure, tall, still, watching us, just watching. I looked, heart hammering, and for a moment I thought I saw it too. A shadow, impossibly tall, impossibly still, standing at the edge of the mist. And then, like smoke, it was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavier than before, pressing into the back of my mind, whispering that it had never left. The trail had vanished completely by now. No marker, no bend, no familiar landmark. The forest was a labyrinth, twisting and folding in ways that made no sense. Every direction looked the same. Every tree was the same. And through it all, the whispers followed, circling, patient, deliberate. We moved forward as best we could, stepping carefully, trying to ignore the sense of being guided, herded, tested. Every small shadow seemed to twitch with life. Every rustle hinted at hidden eyes. Every whisper promised we were not alone. By mid-morning, exhausted and disoriented, we realized we had walked in a circle. The clearing where we had begun, where the campfire had burned the night before, was just ahead. Familiar, yes, but somehow wrong. Subtle shifts in the shape of trees, the angles of branches. Subtle differences that made the world feel off balance, unfamiliar, as though the forest itself had moved while we slept. We didn't speak much. No one needed to. Fear had settled among us like fog, patient, immovable. We moved slowly, deliberately, every step a negotiation with the unseen presence that had guided us here. And in the distance, just beyond the mist, I thought I saw those eyes again. Faint, amber, patient, watching, waiting, always observing. I realized then fully that leaving was not a choice. The forest didn't let you go. Not really. It could bend paths, erase markers, shift landmarks. It could watch. It could wait. And it could follow you home in ways you would never understand, patient, deliberate, eternal. By the time we finally found a trail that seemed to lead out, none of us laughed. None of us spoke loudly. We were exhausted, shaken, and aware in a way we had never been before. And in the deepest part of my mind, I knew the watcher, the figure, the whispers, the presence, hadn't left. It never would. It would follow, patient, deliberate, shaping the world around us, teaching caution, teaching fear. And I knew, even as I stumbled forward, that someday, if I ever returned, the forest would welcome me back. And I would not be alone. We had been driving for hours, the city falling behind us as the roads narrowed and twisted through dense woods. The kind of trees that let only specks of light through, where every shadow looked deeper than it should, where silence settled like a heavy blanket. I remember glancing at the map on my phone, feeling a small thrill mixed with unease. This was one of those places you shouldn't find. Not easily. And yet there it was, a lodge tucked deep into the forest, forgotten by time and people alike. When we finally reached the driveway, it was almost invisible. The asphalt had cracked, grass growing through the gaps, and the iron gate hung on broken hinges. The forest seemed to press in closer, as if to hide what lay beyond. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease, but the air smelled different here. Stale, musty, like the lodge itself had been holding its breath for decades. The car tires crunched over gravel and broken leaves as we approached the building. It wasn't huge, maybe 3 stories, with a peaked roof and a dozen windows staring blankly at the world. Some of the glass had long since shattered, leaving black holes that reflected the gray light of late afternoon. I could almost hear it. If the walls could speak, what stories would they tell? I tried not to imagine. Maya, always braver than the rest of us, pushed open the main door. It creaked on its long unused hinges. Dust drifted down like tiny motes of snow, catching in the slanting sunlight that made its way through broken shutters. I stepped inside slowly, feeling the floorboards groan beneath my weight. The air smelled of decay, old wood, and something else, something metallic. I swallowed, hoping it was only rust, but the uneasy taste lingered. "Guys, look at this," she whispered, and I followed her into the main hall. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. In one spot, the paper had completely ripped away, revealing dark stains beneath. It didn't take imagination to picture blood, though I told myself it was probably water damage. Still, a chill ran down my spine. We moved further inside, flashlights sweeping across forgotten furniture. Chairs with torn upholstery, tables with surfaces warped from moisture, a fireplace blackened by years of neglect. The air was silent except for the faint sound of our own breathing. And yet, I could swear I heard something else too, a soft, echoing tap, like nails lightly drumming on wood somewhere far away. "It's just the building settling," Lucas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even as he said it, he kept glancing at the shadows, as if expecting one of them to shift. I couldn't tell if he was trying to convince us or himself. Upstairs, the corridor was darker, narrower. The floorboards moaned with every step, and the wallpaper had begun to curl and bubble like it was alive. I kept catching glimpses of shapes in the corners of my eyes. Long shadows, perhaps cast by broken window panes, or maybe something else. My heartbeat quickened, and I tried to remind myself this was just an old, abandoned lodge. People left buildings behind all the time. Nothing here could hurt us. Nothing real, at least. We reached the end of the hallway. A set of double doors loomed before us, each adorned with tarnished brass handles. The sign above them read in faded gold letters, "Main Dining Hall." The room beyond was enormous, ceiling high enough to feel like a cathedral. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floor, once polished oak, was now cracked and splintered. Tables sat in disarray, chairs toppled or missing entirely. I could almost see them. Families, laughter, music, long evenings now frozen in dust. That's when we found the first clues that the lodge had not been empty of stories, dark, whispered stories. Newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, lay scattered on the floor near the fireplace. I bent to pick one up. The headline made my stomach tight. "Triple Murder Shocks Summer Retreat," the date faded but readable decades ago. The words told of guests slain, their bodies left undiscovered until the following morning. Authorities were baffled. No clear motive, no suspect. The lodge was shuttered immediately, abandoned to rot, forgotten. I felt a shiver crawl over me. The air felt colder, though the sun still filtered weakly through the broken windows. Maya's flashlight found another pile of clippings, each detailing similar tragedies: foul play, disappearances, sudden accidents. The same patterns over years. A lodge meant for joy, now remembered only in whispers of horror. I could hear my own breathing, ragged in the silence. The shadows seemed to gather closer around the edges of the room. I told myself it was just our imagination. Buildings that have been empty too long tend to play tricks on your mind. Every creak, every shifting light, every whisper of wind could be explained. But still, I felt eyes on me. Not just any eyes. Patient eyes, waiting, watching from corners too dark to see. We explored the ground floor, careful not to touch anything more than necessary. The kitchen, once bustling with activity, was a graveyard of rusted pans and shattered plates. The basement door, small and narrow, sagged on broken hinges. We didn't go down. Something in the air told me we shouldn't. Some instinct, primal and unrelenting. But I could feel it behind me, urging me to look, to see what had been left behind. Lucas joked about ghosts. Of course he did, but his laugh didn't carry. It was hollow, uneven, a sound that fell flat in the heavy silence. We tried to make light of it, but the walls seemed to absorb our words. Echoes returned, twisted and delayed, until I could no longer tell if it was one of us speaking or the lodge itself answering back. As evening crept closer, the building seemed to shift in the fading light. Shadows stretched unnaturally, corners darkened even where sunlight had once fallen. I felt the floor beneath me tremble slightly, or perhaps it was my imagination, or perhaps the lodge itself was breathing. The sensation was subtle at first, almost comforting, almost familiar, but the more I noticed it, the more it became oppressive. The lodge wasn't empty. Not really. When we finally decided to leave, I noticed the front door didn't seem like the same door we had entered. The hallway stretched farther than I remembered. The air had grown thick, damp, smelling of rot and rust. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob, but it felt heavier, colder than it should have been. Behind me, the shadows seemed to lean closer. Not menacing exactly, observing, patient, waiting. I glanced back at the main hall, at the scattered clippings, at the broken furniture frozen in time. For a moment I could almost see them, the guests from decades ago, smiling, laughing, then frozen, trapped in the air like dust motes. The weight of their story pressed down on me, a cold and patient weight that made it hard to breathe. We stepped outside finally, the forest welcoming us back into its arms. The lodge sat there in the clearing, silent, empty, or so we thought. But I knew we had left a part of ourselves behind, our shadows stretching into the corners, joining the lingering memory of those long-gone tragedies. And as we drove away, the last rays of sunlight catching on the broken windows, I could swear I saw a shape in one of the upper windows. Tall, still, watching, patient, waiting, not just for us, but for anyone who dared enter. Some places are meant to be forgotten. Some doors are never truly closed. And some stories, no matter how deeply buried, never stop waiting. After the initial shock of stepping inside the lodge had worn off, we began exploring more carefully, our flashlights cutting through the heavy shadows. The place seemed alive with memories, though not the kind we wanted to witness. Each room whispered in its own way, creaking floors, dust motes dancing in weak sunlight, the faint scent of mildew. But it wasn't until we entered what looked like an old parlor that I felt the lodge's weight truly press against me. On a long, narrow table, half buried under yellowed newspapers and broken knickknacks, lay a stack of photographs. They were old, faded at the edges, curling slightly as if recoiling from the air. I reached down, careful not to disturb them too roughly, and picked one up. It was a family photo. A mother, father, and 2 children, all smiling politely at the camera. Their clothing was outdated, the kind you only see in black and white yearbooks or old postcards. At first it seemed innocent, even cheerful. But then my eyes drifted. The mother's smile stretched a little too wide, the father's eyes dark and hollow. The children's faces had been blurred slightly, like someone had smeared them on the print itself. I set the photo down, heart beginning to thud faster. "Do you see this?" I whispered to Maya, who had been examining the next photo in the stack. She leaned over, squinting. Her voice trembled slightly. "Yeah, that's not right." We spent the next hour going through the pile. Each photo was the same. Families posed in front of the lodge, picnics on the lawn, children playing by a fountain. Smiles, laughter frozen in film. And yet something was always off. Eyes blurred, faces unnaturally elongated or pinched. In one, a girl appeared to be looking at us from the image, though she should have been staring at the camera. Another, a man's hand seemed to stretch toward the edge of the photo, as though reaching beyond its paper confines. I tried to reason it out. Maybe they had been damaged by time, moisture, or careless handling. Maybe it was shadows playing tricks in my tired mind. But each photograph, each image, whispered the same quiet unease, tugging at the corners of thought where rationality begins to falter. "Do you think someone did this on purpose?" Lucas murmured, his voice low. "Altered the photos?" I shook my head. "I don't know, maybe, but why? And why leave them here?" A breeze stirred from somewhere deep within the lodge, though no windows were open. The papers fluttered slightly, as if brushing against invisible fingertips. I caught a movement from the corner of my eye. Something, or someone, shifted behind a broken doorway just out of reach of the flashlight's beam. My pulse quickened, but when I turned fully, nothing was there. Only shadow, only silence, only the faded photographs. We spread the photos across the table, trying to examine them closely without touching too much. The more we looked, the more disturbing details emerged. In one, a boy's arm was unnaturally long, bent at an odd angle behind his back. In another, a woman's eyes, though still blurred, seemed to glisten, as though wet with tears that hadn't yet fallen. My stomach knotted. "This isn't normal," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "Maybe it's a trick of the light," Maya offered, though her voice lacked conviction. She had been unusually quiet, staring at a photo of a smiling couple standing on the lodge's front steps. Something about them unnerved her, I could tell. The way the man's shadow seemed heavier than it should have been. The woman's grin that stretched too far, as if the camera had caught more than a smile. I felt drawn to another photo, partially hidden under the stack. It was different. Smaller, square, the edges jagged as if torn from an album. I picked it up carefully. In the photo, a single child sat on a swing, motionless. The air in the photograph itself seemed to vibrate, a subtle tension that made me breathe a little faster. Her eyes, or what should have been her eyes, were nothing but smudges, dark and wet-looking. And behind her, in the shadows of the trees, a tall shape lingered. Not human, not animal, something that seemed to bend the space around it. I shivered. "Look at this," I said, holding it up for Lucas. He took it, eyes narrowing. "I don't know what I'm looking at," he said, his voice tight. "It doesn't make sense." And that was the problem. Nothing here made sense. Nothing should feel like it was watching, like it had presence even on paper. But it did. Every photograph felt alive, a frozen whisper of memory twisted into something else. Maya set hers down with a small shiver. Do you think these are connected to what happened here?" I didn't answer immediately. I wanted to, but I couldn't. The thought was too big, too heavy, too dark. The murders, the disappearances, the lodge abandoned for decades. And here we were, handling pieces of it, staring at moments frozen in a way that didn't feel right. The air seemed to grow colder as we lingered, even though the day outside was mild. The shadows of the lodge thickened in the corners, long and unnatural. And I could feel it again, that sensation of being watched. Patient, careful, not threatening, but observing. I placed a photo back on the table and stepped back. The others followed, glancing at one another with unease. We were trespassers, intruders into a space that had been holding its breath for decades. And yet, it wasn't just the lodge. It was the photographs, the images of the people who had once been here. They were waiting for something, and the longer we stared, the more I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing against me. I wanted to leave, but the thought of stepping back into the fading sunlight outside felt wrong. We had entered this lodge thinking it was just abandoned, empty, forgotten. But nothing here was forgotten. The walls, the floors, the photographs, they remembered. They remembered everything. We spent the next hour in uneasy silence, examining what we dared, each sound amplified in the heavy air. A floorboard creaked behind me, though I had already stepped carefully to avoid them. Something whispered, not a word, not quite, but a soft breath of movement, as if the lodge itself were exhaling. Finally, we gathered what photos we had examined and placed them gently back on the table. The weight in the room did not lift. Shadows pooled deeper in the corners, the musty air seemed thicker, and I could feel the lodge's history brushing against my mind. I didn't want to look again, but a part of me did. A part that would always remember the eyes blurred, the smiles stretched, the shapes in the background. Waiting, patient. Before we moved on to the next room, I caught a glimpse of one photograph lying flat, its image almost entirely black. I bent closer. In the dark smear, I thought I saw movement, a shape that shifted, too deliberate, too aware. I blinked and it was gone, but the sense of being observed remained, lingering in my chest, heavy and quiet. We left the parlor shortly after, moving down the hallway in silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the photographs had followed us somehow, that the lodge had seen us, cataloged us, just as it had the families in the images decades ago. I could feel their eyes, or what had replaced them, in the shadows at the edges of my vision. Somewhere in the depths of the lodge, the past was not at rest, and we had just arrived. We moved cautiously through the lodge, our footsteps muted against the rotting floorboards. Every room we entered seemed to breathe with its own history, the walls humming faintly with memories I didn't want to acknowledge. The photographs had unsettled us enough. faces blurred and eyes that didn't belong to anyone alive. But it was the silence afterward that pressed against me like a physical weight. Lucas had taken point, his flashlight beam cutting across the hall. Maya followed behind, keeping her hand on the wall for balance as though the lodge itself might tilt and throw her off. I lagged just slightly, listening to the creaks of the building as we moved. That's when I first heard it, the soft, deliberate rhythm of footsteps from above. I froze, my pulse immediately quickened. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Lucas stopped and tilted his head. "Hear what?" "They're upstairs," I said, voice low. Footsteps slow, steady. Maya's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall. "There's no one up there. We already checked the second floor. It's empty." "I know what I heard," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Soft steps like someone packing, carefully, watching. We exchanged uneasy glances. The kind of glance that carries both fear and the unspoken thought that maybe fear alone wasn't enough. I told myself it was the lodge settling. Old buildings shift and groan with age. Maybe a loose floorboard upstairs echoing faintly in a hollow room. Rational thoughts, calm explanations. But as the next step sounded, deliberate and certain, I couldn't ignore the hair rising on the back of my neck. Lucas moved ahead, flashlight raised, signaling for us to follow. I hesitated. The hall stretched longer than it should have, the shadows curling at its edges, waiting. Upstairs, the corridor seemed narrower than I remembered. Dust swirled in our flashlight beams. I saw the doorways to empty rooms, peeling wallpaper, cracked ceilings, but no one. Nothing. And yet the footsteps continued. Light, deliberate, moving from one end of the hall to the other. They paused briefly, then resumed. A rhythm both natural and calculated, like someone intentionally making us aware of them. Maya whispered, I don't like this. Maybe we should go back downstairs." I wanted to agree. I wanted to tell her we could leave this place, but something inside me refused. Part of me had to see, had to know. The curiosity, the sense of trespassing through time, overpowered the fear. The floor creaked ahead of us, ours or theirs. I couldn't tell. And then a soft thump, like a foot pressing firmly on a step directly above me. I froze, holding my breath. The sound repeated, slow, methodical, deliberate. It moved along the hall, paused, then reversed direction. Lucas spoke quietly, almost to himself. "This isn't possible. The second floor is empty." I nodded, though the words did little to calm me. Something in that lodge refused to follow ordinary rules. And whatever it was, it seemed to know we were here, even though we were still strangers. I found myself peeking into one of the rooms. A child's bedroom, long abandoned. Small bed in the corner, mattress yellowed with age, a broken doll lying face down on the floor. The footsteps grew louder for a moment, as though drawn closer to us, then faded again. Maya clutched my arm. It's playing with us," she whispered. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell her it was the building, echoes bouncing in the hallways, shadows casting illusions. But deep down, I knew we weren't alone. Not in the way we wanted to believe. Not in the way that could be explained away with creaking wood or settling foundations. We continued slowly down the hall, stopping at each doorway, listening. Every few seconds, a soft step would echo above, carefully spaced. And then silence. The lodge seemed to shift around us. The air grew heavier, charged with some invisible presence, as if each breath we drew stirred unseen threads above. I realized I could almost feel the weight of something packing, its attention fully on us, though unseen. Lucas turned sharply at one point, flashlight scanning a corner where shadow pooled. "It's just shadows," he muttered, though his voice lacked certainty. But they weren't just shadows. Not anymore. The pattern of the steps, slow, deliberate, suggested intelligence, intent. Someone or something was aware we were intruding, measuring us, observing our reactions, and perhaps waiting for us to slip, to make a mistake. I thought of the photographs we had seen downstairs. The faces with blurred eyes, the faint shapes lurking in the backgrounds. Was this the same presence? Had it been here all along, living in the lodge in forms we couldn't quite perceive, hiding behind walls, ceilings, shadows, until someone disturbed its space? Maya's hand tightened on mine. "I don't like it," she said again, voice small and trembling. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing thoughts. We were intruders, yes, but we were also witnesses. Witnesses to something long forgotten, yet very much alive in its own way. And it was reminding us that we weren't supposed to be here. The footsteps began again, moving in small, careful circles as though walking along the edges of the hallway. I noticed something chilling. No matter which room we checked, the sound shifted perfectly, maintaining distance, teasing us. There was no corner for it to hide. There was no floorboard that could carry sound in such precision. We paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Each step above slowed, then stopped. Silence. My ears strained, waiting for the next move. And then nothing. I exhaled slowly, hoping the sound had stopped for good. But the air remained tense, thick, as if the lodge itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. I felt a chill creep along my spine. "Maybe we should leave," Lucas finally whispered. Maya nodded frantically. "Now." I wanted to protest, to push on, but I couldn't deny the sense of danger, subtle yet pervasive. The presence that had revealed itself through sound was patient, and I had no idea how far its patience could reach. We descended the stairs carefully, every step slow and deliberate. My mind raced, thinking about the people who had been here before us. The families in the photographs, the visitors who vanished, the murders that had shuttered this lodge for decades. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Whatever had haunted this place before, it had not been gone. It had merely waited. By the time we reached the bottom floor, the air seemed lighter almost, but only slightly. The memory of the footsteps lingered, echoing in my mind, even as we moved away from the stairwell. I could feel the lodge's awareness following us, pressing gently at the edges of my perception. And in that lingering pressure, I understood something terrifying. We had been observed from the moment we stepped inside. From the photographs to the shadows to the deliberate steps above us, the lodge had marked us. And whether it followed us or merely waited for our curiosity to lead us further, I could not say. All I knew was that the footsteps upstairs were real, deliberate, intelligent, and the moment we thought we had left them behind, they would still be there, packing silently in memory, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to enter. After the footsteps upstairs, we didn't speak much. The lodge seemed heavier somehow, as though it had settled even further into its own history, pressing against us with quiet insistence. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, thick enough to make breathing deliberate. I felt a weight on my chest, a slow tightening that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. We were in the main hallway now, the flashlight beams stretching ahead like cautious fingers probing the dark. That's when I saw it, the basement door at the far end, shrouded in shadow, its surface worn and gray, chains coiled tight around its handle. The lock was rusted, as if it had been left undisturbed for decades, yet the sense of being watched came from it as clearly as from anything we had seen so far. Lucas approached first, flashlight bouncing over the chains. "I didn't even notice this before," he muttered, voice low. "How did we miss a basement in a building this size?" Maya shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't think we want to find out," she said softly. I stepped closer. The chain rattled under my fingertips as I brushed against it, and that's when I heard it, a scratching, low and deliberate, coming from the other side of the door. Slow, persistent, like fingernails dragging along old wood. I pulled back sharply, the sound echoing in the hall and filling the lodge with a pulse of dread I could feel in my stomach. "It's probably a rat," Lucas said, though his words carried a nervous edge. I didn't answer, because I knew it wasn't a rat. There was intelligence in that sound, a rhythm, a pause, a scrape that was too deliberate to be the random gnawing of a rodent. And then, as if it sensed our attention, the scratching stopped for a long, tense moment. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Maya whispered, It knows we're here." I swallowed hard. I wanted to convince myself otherwise. Wanted to step back into rational thought, to tell myself we were just exploring, that this place was abandoned, nothing alive behind the walls. But the chill creeping up my spine said otherwise. It told me that this building, this lodge, had secrets it refused to let go, and we were intruders. I knelt slightly, peering under the door. Darkness stretched into the basement, unbroken, except for the faint glimmer of the metal lock. And then another scratch, sharper this time, like something scratching a message. I stepped back instinctively, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lucas was quieter now. His bravado had vanished somewhere in the space between curiosity and fear. We don't have to open it," he said. I shook my head, though the thought made my stomach tighten. "We need to know," I said. The words sounded braver than I felt. Maya looked at me wide-eyed. "We could leave," she whispered. "We could just go." But curiosity had a hold of me, a slow, insidious pull that overrode the panic. Every story I had ever heard about this lodge, every warning in the photographs and newspaper clippings came back in fragments. And now the basement door was here, chains and all, demanding to be acknowledged. We found an old crowbar lying nearby, forgotten in a corner. The metal was cold and slightly bent, but it was enough. Lucas worked at the chain, grunting as the rust gave way with a loud, echoing snap. My ears rang from the suddenness of the sound. The lock fell to the floor with a metallic clatter, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the scratching resumed, louder, more insistent, directly from behind the door. We froze, holding our breaths. The sound was methodical, deliberate, like someone packing just out of sight, testing the bounds of the door. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Lucas stopped me with a gentle but firm grip. "Wait, think about this. Really think about this." I nodded slowly, forcing myself to step back. The presence behind that door was alive, aware. Not alive in the way humans are, but aware enough to make me reconsider everything we thought we knew about fear. And yet, the curiosity was unbearable. Finally, we agreed to open it slowly. Lucas lifted the handle. The door groaned in protest, dust spilling into the hallway, particles catching in the flashlight beams. The air shifted immediately, colder, heavier, carrying a musty scent, like wet earth and decayed wood. The basement stretched downward into darkness. Stairs lined with splintered wood descended into a black void, and from that darkness, the scratching had stopped. Silence fell like a blanket, suffocating and total. I wanted to call out, to say something reassuring to Maya and Lucas, but my voice was caught in my throat. I could hear every small sound, the drip of water somewhere below, the faint scuttle of something moving. And then, almost imperceptibly, a soft whisper, unintelligible at first, brushing against my ears like the passing of wind. Lucas whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded. Something was down there, something patient, waiting. I could feel its awareness, like a pulse in the floorboards beneath me, pressing upward. The scratching had not stopped. It had merely changed, became subtler, hidden under the quiet, threading its way into my consciousness. Maya shivered, her breath visible in the cold air that seeped from the basement. "We shouldn't," she began, but I interrupted. "We can't leave it like this," I said, voice trembling despite my attempt at calm. "We need to see, just a little." We descended slowly. Each step groaned, echoing into the darkness below. The air grew damper, thicker, smelling of rot and something more indefinable, something ancient. The darkness seemed almost tangible, pressing against us, flowing around our legs, reaching with invisible fingers. And then I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, just beyond the flashlight beams, shapes moved, quick, fleeting, impossible to define. Shadows that shouldn't have been, bending and stretching along the walls. And I knew without any doubt that the scratching, the whispers, the deliberate presence above, all of it had a form down here. Watching, waiting, measuring our fear. We froze, breathing carefully. Every instinct screamed to turn, to run, but our curiosity chained us in place. Something shifted in the darkness, a faint, scraping motion just beyond sight. A slow step, deliberate, and then another. The scratching began again, closer now, circling us like a predator testing its prey. We could hear it in every corner of the basement, behind every shadowed stair, above and below. Not random, not chaotic, but intentional, patient. I reached out, almost without thinking, towards the nearest shape, as though by acknowledging it I could understand it. But the moment my fingers brushed the darkness, it recoiled, and a whisper, low, guttural, almost human, slithered across the basement. Maya gasped. Lucas stepped back sharply, and in that instant the air changed. The presence shifted, receding just slightly, but leaving a residue of tension that settled deep into my bones. We didn't speak. We couldn't. The basement had marked us now. It had shown itself just enough to terrify, to warn, to imprint the memory of its existence into our minds. Finally, Lucas whispered, "We need to leave, now." I nodded, voice gone, heart pounding. Slowly, we backed up the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding far too loud in the oppressive quiet. Once on the main floor, we didn't stop until we were back in the hall, away from the basement door. The air felt slightly lighter, but the knowledge of what lurked below remained. The scratching, the whispering, the deliberate presence, none of it was gone. It had only receded, waiting for us to leave, for the next curious intruder to disturb the lodge. And I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that the basement had its secrets, secrets that were alive, patient, and far older than any of us could comprehend. Even as we stepped away, the faint echo of scratches followed us, lingering in the memory of the walls, in the corners of the rooms, in the dark that stretched infinitely below the lodge. I realized then, with a chill that settled into my core, that the basement had waited for us, and it would continue waiting, long after we were gone, for the next visitor foolish enough to hear its subtle call. We didn't speak as we scrambled up the stairs from the basement. The echo of the scratches, the whispers, and the unseen presence clinging to our skin refused to leave. Every step felt like it was sinking into something older, heavier than wood or dust. It was as if the lodge itself was holding us, measuring our fear, weighing our curiosity against the safety we had abandoned the moment we crossed the threshold. Maya's breathing was shallow, rapid. She clutched my arm tightly, nails pressing through my jacket. Lucas was ahead, flashlight shaking slightly, his face pale and drawn, eyes darting over every corner, every shadow. None of us said a word, and I think part of us knew that sound, once heard, could never be unremembered. We reached the main hall. The floorboards creaked underfoot, a reminder of the lodge's age and the fragility of our presence within it. I noticed something immediately, a photograph lying on the floor, near the faded rug where we had paused only minutes before. I froze. The photograph was old, its edges curled and yellowed like all the others we had found upstairs. But this one was different. It showed us. Not posed, not staged, but caught in motion, exactly as we were just then. Lucas with the flashlight, Maya gripping my arm, me looking down at the floor. The image was impossibly fresh, impossibly recent, as if it had been taken only moments ago. I swallowed hard, a chill spreading down my spine. That wasn't here before, I whispered. Lucas crouched to inspect it. No way, this how? His voice trembled. There's no one here, there's no camera. Maya's hands trembled as she reached toward it, then drew back. It's watching us, she said, voice barely audible. It's been watching the whole time. We didn't need confirmation. The basement, the photographs, the whispers, the unseen movements, they had been watching. Every step, every sound, every hesitant flick of the flashlight had been noted, recorded in some way that defied explanation. I picked up the photograph cautiously. The image was slightly blurred, but not enough to hide the details. Our expressions, the tension, the fear, the hesitation, all captured in a single frame. I felt exposed, as if the building itself had found a way to peer directly into our minds, freezing our fear into a tangible object. "We leave now," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "We go. No more photos, no more curiosity." Lucas and Maya nodded. We moved quickly toward the entrance, the air thick and still, pressing against us like it wanted to slow our exit, like the lodge itself was reluctant to let us go. Each step felt heavier than the last. The shadows seemed to stretch and recoil, following us as we passed, whispering faintly, brushing at our minds with indecipherable words. As we neared the main door, the light from our flashlights flickered. A soft wind, or what felt like wind, brushed past us, carrying with it a musty scent of decayed wood and wet earth, like the basement reaching upward to remind us of what lurked below. Then Lucas stopped suddenly. I almost collided with him. "What?" I hissed. He pointed down, another photograph. This one lay right by the threshold, as if placed deliberately under our feet. My stomach tightened. I bent to pick it up. The image showed us again, this time from an angle we couldn't have possibly seen, the perspective of someone or something, floating just above the ground, watching us. Our expressions were terror-stricken, frozen in the instant of awareness that we were being recorded. Maya whispered, "It's not just a camera, it's alive." The words barely left her lips before the air shifted. A sound like soft scraping, distant but immediate, came from somewhere behind the lodge. Not the basement, not the hallways, but the exterior walls, the roof, the very air around us. I shivered, feeling the pulse of it, like the building itself was breathing, watching, reacting. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, to leave this place behind and forget the photographs, the whispers, the sense of being measured. But my legs felt weighted, reluctant, as though the lodge had anchored us just enough to delay our exit. Lucas whispered, Don't look back." We obeyed. We stepped out into the cold night air, the forest beyond the clearing dense and dark, yet strangely still. The trees swayed gently in a breeze that didn't seem to exist, shadows brushing across the ground like fingers reaching for us. The lodge loomed behind us, silent, patient, as though it had allowed our departure only to ensure that we carried the memory of it with us. We didn't speak as we moved toward the road, flashlights sweeping the undergrowth, ears straining for sounds that might follow. The photographs weighed on me, not physically, but in a way that pressed on my mind. How could an abandoned building have the ability to capture the present, to record our movements, our fear, our very awareness of it? We reached the car in near silence. I paused at the door, looking back once, and the lodge stood there, unchanged, yet somehow more knowing, more alive. I could almost feel the eyes in the photographs on the floor, watching, waiting, aware that we had seen what we weren't meant to see. Maya slid into the passenger seat, shaking. Lucas fumbled with the keys, hands trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my own racing pulse, the images from the photographs replaying in my mind. Each frame, each shadow, each whisper. It was all too deliberate, too intelligent to be mere coincidence. When the car roared to life and we pulled onto the road, the lodge disappeared into the darkness behind us, obscured by trees and shadows. Yet the photographs, they were with us. I glanced down at the one that had slipped between the seats, and my stomach sank. It showed us in the car, driving away, yet the angle was impossible, taken from inside the vehicle, from a perspective we had never occupied. No one spoke. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Every instinct screamed that we were not alone, that the lodge had extended itself beyond its walls, beyond its space, into the very world around us. By the time we reached the highway, headlights cutting through the night, the photographs lay scattered between us on the seats, each frame capturing us, following us, documenting our fear, our hesitation, our futile attempt to escape. Maya finally whispered, "It doesn't stop, does it?" I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say that would make it real or unreal. All I could do was feel the dread pressing at my chest, the unshakable certainty that we had been seen, measured, and recorded by something patient, ancient, and aware. Even as the city lights appeared in the distance, I knew it wasn't over. The lodge had claimed its last frame, and somehow I feared it had claimed us too. By the time we reached my apartment, the car door closed with a hollow thud, and we finally breathed, releasing some of the tension coiled tightly within us. Yet the photographs remained. On the seat, on the floor, even a small one clutched in my hand. Each frame a reminder, a proof, a warning. I placed them on the table, staring at them under the harsh light of my apartment lamp. And as I studied the last photograph, the one taken of us moments ago, inside the car, I realized something impossible. The figure in the background was there, not blurred, not distorted, watching, waiting, patient. I felt my own reflection in the glass of the frame, my fear mirrored back at me. And I understood something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The lodge's influence was not confined to its walls. It followed, it watched, it recorded, and the last frame was never truly the last. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it. Just beyond my vision, subtle, silent, patient, waiting for the moment I look away, waiting to record the next frame, the next movement, the next breath. The lodge had marked us, and there would be no forgetting it. I had been hiking that trail for hours, the forest stretching endlessly around me, thick with pine and the low hum of distant streams. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, leaving long shadows that twisted between the trunks like fingers. I hadn't expected anyone else out here, which is why I nearly stumbled over it. A small, tattered journal, wedged under a pile of damp leaves, its leather cover cracked and worn, the edges eaten by moisture and time. At first I hesitated. Who leaves a journal here? And why would it be so exposed, as if waiting for someone to find it? My fingers brushed the cover carefully, half expecting it to crumble, but it held together as though insisting I look inside. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded almost to illegibility. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Uneven, nervous, hurried in places, with long streaks where the writer had pressed too hard. Maybe out of fear or frustration. Flipping the first page, I read the words aloud quietly, almost instinctively, though I knew no one was around to hear. I thought I knew these woods, the first entry began. I thought I could handle the quiet, the isolation, but the forest, it watches, it waits. I see it in the shadows just beyond the edge of the trail. And the trees, they whisper, not with wind, not with rustling leaves, but with voices. Voices that tell me I am not alone. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced around the forest, suddenly aware of how silent it had become. The usual rustle of squirrels or birdsong had faded. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, holding its breath. I settled against a tree and continued reading. Each page told of someone who had walked these paths before me, someone who had thought they were prepared. The entries grew darker with each line, more desperate, the handwriting slanting downward as though the writer were literally sinking under the weight of fear. They follow me, one entry read. I hear footsteps behind me, always just behind me, but when I turn, there is nothing, only the shadows. The deeper I go, the more I realize the forest is alive and it does not like me here. It will not let me leave. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. Of course, there was nothing, only the muted green of pine and the last orange streaks of sunset. Yet the words stayed with me, insistent like a pulse in my veins. As I read further, the entries became fragmented, sentences cut off mid-thought. The writer wrote of hearing whispers at night, seeing figures gliding through the trees, and feeling a presence that was neither human nor animal, something that waited patiently, sometimes quietly, sometimes closer than a heartbeat. I can hear it breathing, one line read. Not a person, not an animal, something older, something patient. I do not know how much longer I can endure this. I am so tired, but I cannot rest. I cannot stop moving. I cannot escape it. The journal had been found in the leaves, and yet it felt like it had been left intentionally. Left for me, for someone else, to discover the truth too late. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to shake the creeping sensation that someone, or something, was following me along the trail just out of sight. Night was approaching. The sky had turned a dark gray, and the shadows between the trees deepened into black shapes that seemed to shift as I looked at them. My instincts told me to move, to keep walking toward the parking lot where my car waited. But the journal had me rooted. I needed to know the end. I flipped to one of the last entries. The words were scrawled with trembling hands, nearly illegible. "They are all gone," it read. "I am alone now. I thought I could survive, but the forest has claimed them. It watches and it waits for me to falter. Tonight I will try to leave, but I know it will not allow me to go. I hear them in the trees. I see the shadows moving toward me, and still I cannot run fast enough." My heart pounded as I read. It was not just fear on the page, it was reality. The forest was alive in a way I had never experienced. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as though it had weight. Every rustle, every branch snapping underfoot felt amplified. I looked around, telling myself it was only the wind. I tucked the journal carefully into my backpack, as if it were a delicate animal, fragile and dangerous at once. Every step I took back toward the main trail made me feel the forest shift around me, closing in slightly, the shadows stretching longer, the shapes just at the periphery of vision. I could almost hear faint whispers, carried on the breeze. Not words I could understand, but tones that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the previous hiker had been paranoid. Maybe the journal was fiction, or an elaborate warning left by someone who had been trapped in their own imagination. But the journal's presence, and the weight of the words, felt undeniably real. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to put as much distance between myself and the pages filled with fear as possible. As darkness fell completely, I noticed something unsettling. The forest didn't seem empty. It felt full, but in ways I couldn't name. The shapes of the trees seemed to lean slightly toward the path, their branches reaching like hands, and the underbrush whispered beneath my boots as if the ground itself had secrets it wanted to share. The journal thumped against my spine with each step, a reminder that the forest had been patient, waiting for someone like me to find it. When I finally emerged from the dense trees onto the small clearing that led to the parking area, I allowed myself a brief exhale of relief. The shadows remained behind me, long and dark, but the open space felt safer. The moon rose above the treetops, casting silver light across the trail, softening the fear, at least temporarily. I paused and looked back. The forest loomed silently, indifferent to my presence, yet somehow aware. The journal in my backpack seemed heavier than it should have been, as if the weight of the stories inside pressed down on me, anchoring me to this place. I realized then that the journal was more than a collection of experiences. It was a warning, a record, perhaps a lure. Whoever had written it had wanted to make sure the next person would know the forest's rules, its hunger, its patience, its silent vigilance. I started walking again, faster this time, the gravel crunching underfoot, the car headlights approaching in the distance. And yet, no matter how quickly I moved, I could still feel it, just beyond sight. The forest, alive, patient, watching. Even now, days later, I feel the weight of that journal pressing against my mind. The whispers I thought I had left behind in the trees sometimes return when I close my eyes. And every so often, when the wind rustles in a certain way, I swear I can hear footsteps in the leaves, moving just behind me. I never know if I'm remembering the forest correctly or if it follows me still. And sometimes, I wonder if the journal found me not by accident, but by design, leaving me with the terrible realization that some stories are never truly finished. They wait for the next person to wander too far, to listen too closely, to find themselves in the leaves. The next morning, I woke with the journal still pressed against my side, as if it had somehow moved closer in the night. I swore I hadn't moved it, though I couldn't explain how it had shifted. My backpack, where I had carefully tucked it the night before, now seemed to weigh heavier than ever, like the forest itself had lent it gravity. I hesitated before opening it, half afraid of what I might read next. But curiosity, that insistent itch, made me flip the pages. The handwriting, jagged and trembling, drew me deeper. One page in particular seemed almost like a confession, a warning carved into the margins. They are silent, not in the way a person is silent, but in the way the shadows are silent. They follow without sound, but I can hear their patience, their waiting. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves is proof that I am not alone. I swallowed hard. Reading it now, the words didn't just describe fear, they were a map of it. I thought of my own hike the day before, of the strange quiet that seemed to press down on me as I carried the journal along the trail. And then it hit me. The snapping of a small branch, faint, almost imperceptible, came from somewhere behind me. I froze. My heart thumped against my ribs like a drum, and my breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was only a squirrel or a bird. But even as I rationalized, another sound came, soft, deliberate, a step in rhythm with my own. I spun around. Nothing. Only the dense forest, the long pines swaying gently in the morning breeze. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I had imagined it, that the journal's words were infecting my mind. The next entry in the journal confirmed what I had feared. I thought I was alone. I thought the forest would leave me be if I stayed on the path, but I hear them, behind me, always behind me, not human but alive. They move like the trees, like the wind. They watch when I sleep. They wait while I walk, and I cannot make them stop. I looked down at the page and noticed the ink here was smudged, streaks running down as though the writer had cried, or perhaps sweated, so much that the letters bled. I could almost hear the person's despair through the page, like an echo carried across time. I tried to take another step forward toward the main trail, but the forest seemed to respond. The sounds around me shifted, subtle at first, a rustle of leaves to the left, a snapping twig to the right. Then, soft footsteps that did not match my own pace, never quite behind, never ahead, just beside me. I stopped entirely. I dared not breathe too loudly. The journal slipped in my hands and I clutched it tighter, as if it could protect me somehow, though I had no reason to think it could. Another entry caught my eye. They wait for you to notice, not with anger, not with malice, but with patience. They are older than the trail, older than the pines. You can't see them fully, but you will know them in the moments between heartbeats. They walk while you sleep, while you think yourself alone. They are always near and always quiet. I swallowed again, my throat dry. My eyes scanned the surrounding trees, searching for movement, for any sign of life. But the forest remained still, almost eerily so. The morning sunlight filtered through the branches, creating shifting patterns of gold and shadow on the forest floor. And yet, the pattern felt wrong somehow, like it had been arranged intentionally, not by the sun or the wind, but by something waiting, patient, silent. I forced myself to take another step, then another. The sounds followed, soft, almost imperceptible, matching my own pace now, falling in line with my movements. My pulse quickened. I could feel a presence moving just beyond the range of vision, a shadow that mirrored me without form, without edges. I opened the journal again. The pages seemed to tremble under my fingers, or perhaps it was me. They know when you read. They know when you are frightened. Do not look back too long. Do not pause for too long. They do not need to hurry, for you will tire first. You cannot outpace them. You cannot outwait them. You can only survive long enough to leave. The word survive echoed in my mind, becoming a mantra against the creeping dread. I tried to focus on the trail, the familiar markers I had passed the day before. But as I moved, I noticed the path itself seemed to shift. A bend I was certain had been right led me to a familiar tree I had passed earlier. The forest was disorienting, folding in on itself, twisting in ways that made no sense. And always the soft footsteps. I had to stop. I pressed my back against a tree, hoping that the shadows might pass me by if I became still enough. My hands shook as I clutched the journal, reading another fragment. Do not trust the quiet. Do not trust the light. Do not trust the sound of your own heart. They are patient. They are waiting. They do not breathe as you do, but they are there. You are not alone. I closed my eyes, listening, and then I heard it, a sound that froze me completely. Not a twig snapping, not a branch shifting, but a soft, deliberate step, heavier than before, just beyond the range of sight, moving closer. I opened my eyes. Nothing. Only the dense forest, the green and brown and gold, the shadows stretching unnaturally long in the morning sun. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe it was the journal affecting me, filling my mind with fear so that every sound became proof of pursuit. But then the unmistakable scent hit me. Wet earth, pine needles crushed underfoot, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like rust or blood, carried on the breeze. My stomach churned. The journal felt impossibly heavy in my hands, as if it knew. I forced myself to continue walking, step by step, toward the main clearing I had passed yesterday, toward the distant sound of my car parked at the trailhead. Each step brought a fresh wave of unease, every snap and rustle amplified in my mind. I was being followed, I was certain now, by something that did not exist in any normal sense, something that could walk silently, vanish into the air, and yet leave its presence tangible in sound and smell. I glanced at the journal one last time before tucking it into my pack. The final words on the page seemed to pulse in my mind. They watch, they wait. They will not be seen fully, but you will feel them. You will hear them. And if you linger too long, you will join the leaves, and the trail will forget you as easily as it forgets the morning mist. I exhaled sharply and forced myself forward. Each step was measured, careful, aware. The forest was no longer simply trees and earth. It was a presence, patient, waiting, a living memory of the fear that had accumulated here over decades. I made it back to the parking area eventually, my legs trembling, my heart still racing. The journal rested in my pack, heavier now, filled with warnings and stories I could not unhear. Even as I drove away, the rustling of the leaves and the faint echo of footsteps seemed to follow me in the rearview mirror. Days later, I can still hear it. Not always, not loudly, but in quiet moments. The soft snap of a twig, a brushing against dry leaves, a sound just behind me that my mind insists is only imagined. And yet I know better. I have read the warnings. I have felt the footsteps. The forest waits, and the journal waits too, for someone else to find it. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching long and dark between the trees. Every sound felt amplified, the rustle of dry leaves underfoot, the faint creak of branches swaying overhead, even the whisper of my own breath. I should have been alone, yet the feeling of being watched settled into my chest like a weight, slow and pressing. The journal lay open in my pack, its pages trembling faintly as if it too sensed the presence. I tried to read, tried to immerse myself in the words, but the sentences blurred together. My mind was too alert, too aware of the tiny sounds that didn't belong. Footsteps, soft, hesitant, ticked out of rhythm with my own. At first, I convinced myself it was wildlife, a deer perhaps, or some small nocturnal creature. But instinct gnawed at me, telling me this was something else entirely. I stopped walking. The forest was silent in one way, yet alive in another. Leaves rustled somewhere far off, and a whisper of movement brushed my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed normal, shifting in the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy. And yet they felt wrong, too deliberate, too patient. I remembered a passage from the journal, one I had skipped over before. They move in the corners of your eyes, not to scare, not to threaten. They simply exist where you are not looking. They follow you as easily as you follow the trail, yet they never tire. Do not run. Do not panic. You only make it easier for them to find you. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself the words were just paranoia, a product of reading too many warnings in isolation. I took a careful step forward, then another. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft, like fabric brushing against bark, almost a sigh carried on the wind. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears. It wasn't a word, not yet, just a sound that suggested presence. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body taut, ready to sprint if I had to. The moonlight revealed nothing, no figure, no movement beyond the natural sway of the trees. Yet the sound persisted, following me, slipping between the branches, around the trunks, never entirely behind me, never entirely ahead. I forced myself to walk again, slower this time, trying to keep calm. Every step I took seemed to echo in the forest, swallowed almost immediately, as though the trees themselves absorbed the sound. And then I noticed something. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, just a glimpse gone before I could focus. Another step, another flicker, always at the periphery, always vanishing when I turned to look. I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself, it's nothing. It's just the night, just your imagination. But the whispering sound followed, faint, persistent, a rhythm too calculated to be natural. I remembered the first day when I thought the journal was simply a curiosity. Now it felt like a guide, a warning I had ignored at my own peril. I tried to open it, read aloud, hoping the sound of my own voice might anchor me. But the words felt hollow. The forest did not respond to logic. The whispers continued, weaving in and out of the pines, circling me, invisible yet unmistakable. Another shadow flitted past, and this time I swore it moved independently of the trees. A dark blur, fleeting, almost human in its motion. I blinked and it vanished. I strained my eyes, trying to catch it again. Nothing. Only the empty trail, the undisturbed undergrowth. The journal seemed to pulse with an urgency I hadn't felt before. I pulled it out, flipping quickly to another warning. They do not reveal themselves fully. Only glimpses, only whispers. If you chase the sight, you lose the trail. If you run from the sound, you draw it nearer. Move with caution. Move with awareness. They learn your rhythm, your habits, your pauses. I tried to remember the last part. Move with awareness. I slowed my pace even more, listening, feeling, attuning myself to the forest. Each step was deliberate. I placed my feet carefully, pressed close to the trail. My ears strained for the faintest shift in sound, the slight crunch of leaf, the whisper that came and went like the edge of a dream. And then the whisper spoke, or at least I thought it did. A soft syllable, almost a consonant, impossible to identify, brushed past my consciousness. I spun, but again nothing. My chest tightened. I realized I was holding my breath, anticipating the next sound, the next flicker of shadow. And that anticipation itself seemed to draw attention, as if the forest, or whatever moved within it, was aware of my fear. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps there was someone else on the trail, another hiker, hidden, playing some cruel game. But the thought offered no comfort. Footprints on the trail remained only mine. There was no indication of anyone else, yet I could not shake the certainty that I was being tracked, observed in ways that defied understanding. I pressed on, each movement deliberate, each sense heightened. A branch cracked far to my left. I froze. The sound did not come again. My imagination wanted to fill the space, to conjure a shape, but I refused. I reminded myself, only glimpses, only whispers. I thought back to the journal, to the repeated insistence that I would feel them more than I would see them. Now I understood. The fear was not in being attacked. It was in being watched, in being followed by something patient and unseen. In the realization that my steps were never alone, that the forest itself seemed complicit, moving subtly to hide them from view. Another flicker at the edge of my vision. A shadow moved against the moonlight just for a heartbeat. My body froze. My hands shook as I reached for the journal. Do not chase the sight. The words repeated in my mind. I lowered my eyes, tried to focus only on the trail, the dirt beneath my feet. The whispering grew, almost imperceptibly, as if it had decided to synchronize with my heartbeat. A brush of sound to my right, then a shift behind me. I dared not turn. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. Each rustle, each flicker, each sound choreographed by an unseen presence that matched my pace, my rhythm. I stopped entirely. For a long moment I just listened. The whispers circled, faded, returned. I could not identify their source. They were not human, not animal. They were something else, patient enough to track every careful step, to wait for mistakes to measure my fear. I remembered another warning from the journal, words that now felt like a lifeline. They follow, but they do not rush. They learn, they wait. If you do not act rashly, if you do not panic, you may yet leave. But one false move, one misstep, and the forest itself will hide you forever. I exhaled slowly, deliberately. My heart still raced, my legs trembled. I took one careful step forward, then another. The whispers receded slightly, though I knew they lingered, patient, invisible, just beyond the circle of moonlight. And as I moved, I understood a terrible truth. This was no ordinary fear. This was a presence older than the trees, older than the trail. A patient observer waiting for me to grow careless, waiting for me to forget the warnings. The forest itself had become a maze of sound and shadow, and I was learning slowly how to navigate it, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. By the time I reached a small clearing, the whispers had quieted, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves. The shadows no longer flickered, at least not within my sight. My hands were shaking, my breath uneven, but I moved cautiously, keeping the journal close, knowing it was more than just paper. It was a guide, a warning, a map of survival. I knew this was only the beginning. The forest was patient. The whispers would return. The shadows would continue to follow. And I, alone and fragile, would have to learn to walk carefully, never fully turning, never fully relaxing, attuned to the rhythm of a presence I could never see, only feel. I woke to silence, or at least what I thought was silence. The kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums, fills the air with tension, and makes every small sound, every creak, every whisper of wind impossible to ignore. My backpack was still beside me, the journal inside, but something felt wrong. I reached for it. My fingers brushed the cover and my heart stuttered. Pages had been torn away. Not neatly, not like someone had borrowed them. Jagged, uneven tears as if ripped in haste. I flipped through the remaining pages and a cold dread settled over me. Large, scrawled letters, smeared with a dark substance that looked like blood, spelled out words I didn't want to read. "You are next." My stomach turned. I had been careful. I had listened. I had followed every warning in the journal, every instruction to move with awareness, to trust the trail but distrust my own eyes. And yet here it was, a threat tangible and undeniable. My hands shook as I closed the journal, pressing it to my chest, trying to calm myself. The forest around me felt different now. Shadows seemed heavier, darker, lingering longer than they should have. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying a faint, almost mocking tone, like a secret being shared just beyond my hearing. I wanted to run, to flee from this spot, but every instinct I had learned from the journal screamed at me to stay calm. One rash move, one panicked step, and I might never leave. I stepped forward cautiously, feeling the earth beneath my boots. Fallen leaves crunched lightly underfoot, and for a brief moment I imagined I heard something else, something deliberate, moving just beyond my vision. A shift in the shadows, a subtle rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be. But the journal's warning echoed in my mind. They follow, they watch, they learn your rhythm. I opened the remaining pages, scanning for guidance, for a reassurance that I hadn't yet encountered. The handwriting seemed frantic, more hurried than before, with lines scratched into the margins. "Do not stop, do not linger, they are patient, they are always patient." The words made me shiver. I remembered the fleeting glimpses, the whispers that had stalked me since night fell. The forest itself had become a kind of labyrinth, shifting subtly, almost as if it were alive. Each step I had taken was mirrored by something unseen, waiting, circling, calculating. I tried to focus on the trail ahead. Moonlight spilled through the canopy, illuminating patches of moss and gnarled roots. The path twisted and turned, familiar yet subtly altered, as though the forest had moved overnight. My sense of direction wavered. Each landmark I had noted before now seemed displaced, altered, impossible to trust. Another glance at the journal made my stomach drop. Where several pages had been torn away, I now noticed fragments of words left behind. A name partially visible. Never leave, another phrase smeared and blurred. They hunger. I swallowed hard. Hunger for what? For fear. For the living? For the journal itself. I didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to move forward, to put distance between myself and whatever had taken those pages, whatever had left the message. I walked carefully, each footstep measured, eyes scanning the trees for movement, for shadows that shouldn't be there. And then I heard it, a faint rustling behind me. My heart leapt. I froze. The sound stopped. I waited, listening, straining to catch the faintest hint of a presence. Nothing. Only the wind whispering through branches and the quiet crunch of my own boots. I told myself to keep moving, to stay rational, to trust my senses. But the forest had begun to warp my confidence, bending my perception of space and time. A tree that should have been behind me now appeared to loom ahead. The path seemed to split unnaturally, though I could not recall any fork from before. I was not sure if I was moving forward or circling back. I paused again, my chest tight. The journal pressed to my chest seemed heavier than before, as if it carried a weight beyond paper and ink. I tried to breathe, tried to slow my racing thoughts. The tears in its pages haunted me. The absence of knowledge, the missing warnings, the incomplete guidance. Whoever or whatever had taken them was sending a message, confirming the warnings. I was not alone. A soft whisper floated through the night. I couldn't tell if it came from behind, above, or beside me. It was fragmented, almost like someone or something, trying to mimic a voice, a fragment of language. Next, always here. I shivered, forcing myself to take another careful step. Each sound now seemed amplified. Leaves rustled under invisible feet. Shadows danced at the edge of vision, vanishing when I dared to look directly. I realized with a sinking certainty that the forest was no longer a passive backdrop. It was an active participant, guiding me, shaping my path, and testing my resolve. I paused, flipping the journal to the last fully intact page. There were instructions, but the ink was smeared, the lines blurred as if someone had tried to obscure them. I traced the words with my finger, reading aloud softly, almost a prayer. Move with care, keep the rhythm, do not chase the shadows, do not flee, watch the trail but do not trust your eyes. The words felt inadequate, almost cruel in their simplicity. I closed the journal, hugging it to my chest again. The forest had grown quieter in some ways, but every pause was a trap. The absence of sound was more terrifying than noise. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they had only retreated, waiting for my next mistake. I pressed on, trying to remember each step, each landmark, each sound that might guide me. Yet the forest shifted subtly, imperceptibly. Roots that had been to the left now seemed to jut from the right. Shadows pooled differently, forming shapes that resembled figures, glimpsed only at the corner of my eye. I forced myself not to look directly, not to acknowledge them. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A fragment of paper lay on the trail, illuminated by a moonbeam. It was torn from the journal, a page that had not been there before. I froze, heart hammering. The page was blank except for a single word, scrawled in the same dark, almost blood-like ink. Soon. I dropped to my knees, trembling. The message was no longer abstract. The forest had communicated directly. Whoever or whatever had taken the pages had been here. They had been following. They had known my path, my pace, my thoughts. The wind stirred and the paper fluttered against the dirt. I wanted to run, but I remembered the journal's warnings. Panic was the wrong choice. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my shaking hands, to move deliberately. One step, then another, each footfall a prayer. I felt it then. A shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Something moved with me, not visible but present, close enough that I could feel the weight of it in the silence, in the way the shadows pooled. The forest seemed to lean in, guiding me, coaxing me, pressing the thread into my awareness without revealing itself. I clutched the journal, moving forward. The torn pages, the blood-like ink, the word soon, they were all proof. Proof that I was being hunted, observed, and studied. Proof that my survival depended on awareness, on caution, on an almost impossible level of patience. And yet I could not stop. The trail stretched ahead, illuminated sporadically by pale moonlight. I moved carefully, step by step, whispering the journal's instructions to myself. Do not chase. Do not flee. Watch. Move with care. The forest was quiet now, eerily so. But I knew better. I knew the whispers were only waiting, the shadows only resting, the presence only patient. And I knew deep in my chest that the torn pages, the scrawled warnings, the very act of being followed, were just the beginning. I pressed on, heart pounding, senses straining, clutching the journal as if it were my lifeline. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured, each sound cataloged and analyzed. And as I moved, I realized the forest was no longer just a place. It was a test, a living, breathing labyrinth of observation, patience, and hidden threats. I did not know if I would reach the end or if there was an end to reach. All I knew was that I could not stop. The journal had been torn, its pages ripped away, but the warnings remained, and I had to survive them. The forest was quiet, or at least I thought it was. I had walked this trail countless times during daylight, each bend and fallen log familiar. But night had a way of transforming the world, of twisting the ordinary into something unfamiliar. The path beneath my boots seemed softer in the moonlight, muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. Every sound felt amplified, the snap of a twig, the distant rush of wind through the treetops. I stopped for a moment, taking a slow breath, telling myself it was just the wind, that the branches brushing against one another were nothing more than ordinary noise. And yet, a sound lingered beneath it all, faint and deliberate, a whisper. "Alex." My head snapped toward the darkness beyond the path. Nothing, just shadows stretching between tree trunks, shifting in patterns that my eyes strained to interpret. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the pulse of fear hammering against my chest. "Alex." The whisper repeated, closer this time. Softer, like a breath brushing against my ear, but with unmistakable clarity. I told myself it couldn't be real. I was alone. The ranger had warned hikers not to stray after dark, but I had insisted. I had wanted the silence, the solitude, the calm of walking beneath the stars. Yet now, the forest seemed alive in ways I had never noticed before. Shapes moved just beyond my peripheral vision. The moonlight glinted off wet bark, creating the illusion of eyes watching me. I tried to convince myself these were tricks of the mind, but my own heartbeat sounded like a drum in the still night. "Alex." The whisper came again, this time from behind me. My stomach tightened and I forced myself to turn slowly, scanning the shadows for anything human, anything real. There was nothing, only the forest, still and indifferent, or so it seemed. I took a cautious step forward. Leaves crunched beneath my boots. A branch broke somewhere to the left and I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The whisper returned, faint, almost apologetic, teasing. "Don't go." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. I had read about this, hikers experiencing auditory hallucinations when isolated at night. Stress, fatigue, imagination running wild. That had to be it. But the sound persisted, growing in insistence, following me with the rhythm of my own steps. The path ahead, illuminated by sparse moonlight, twisted slightly, unfamiliar. I was sure I had walked straight, yet the trail seemed to curve in a way it had not during the day. I stopped again, scanning the darkness. The whisper came from the left now. I could not tell if it moved with me, if the forest itself had become a living thing, or if I had simply become a prey to my own imagination. "Alex." Closer, softer, and yet unmistakable. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the straps of my backpack. I had brought a flashlight, but I wanted to rely on moonlight to keep the experience natural, to feel the forest as it was. Now, I wondered if that had been a mistake. I took another step. The whisper came again, though now it seemed almost layered, as if more than one voice had joined in, murmuring my name, circling me like a predator testing its prey. Alex, Alex, Alex. My mind raced. I tried to recall every step I had taken, every turn in the trail, every tree I had passed. None of it matched. The forest had shifted, or perhaps I had become disoriented. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, forming shapes that suggested something human, something watching. I forced my gaze forward, refusing to look at the shapes at the edges of my vision, but I could not ignore the sensation that the whispers were just behind, just beyond. I quickened my pace slightly, not wanting to run, but needing to put distance between myself and the voices. The whispers followed, persistent and patient, echoing with a rhythm that matched my footsteps. Every time I stopped, they paused, only to resume when I moved again. I paused at a clearing, the moonlight spilling over the soft earth and illuminating a tangle of roots. My breath came in shallow bursts. The whisper came again, this time from multiple directions, a chorus in the silence. Alex, Alex, Alex. I wanted to call back to ask who or what was there. My lips parted, but no sound came. My voice felt small, swallowed by the night. I wanted to run, but a deeper instinct told me that running might only draw attention, might only confirm my presence to whatever, or whoever, was stalking me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward again. Step by step, I traced the path, eyes wide, ears straining. Every rustle of leaves was amplified. Every shadow seemed to flicker with movement. And still the whispers followed, patient, persistent, unseen. I thought about turning back, about returning to the safety of my car, of leaving the forest behind. But even as the thought formed, a sudden awareness settled over me. I did not know if the path behind me was the same one I had taken. The forest had become a labyrinth, subtle in its shifts, small changes that disoriented me, made me second-guess every step. I stopped at a cluster of birches. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, illuminating pale trunks that seemed almost to pulse with life. I pressed my back against one of the trees, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my racing thoughts. And then I realized the whispers had stopped. Silent, absolute oppressive silence. For a heartbeat, I allowed myself a small measure of relief. Perhaps I had reached the edge of the illusion. Perhaps my mind had finally quieted. I opened my eyes and scanned the forest. No shadows moved. No shapes lingered. Nothing. Then just as I exhaled, I heard it, closer this time, right behind me. A single deliberate whisper, low and cold. Alex. I spun around, flashlight raised, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Only the faint rustle of leaves in the night. I told myself again, it had to be my imagination. Fatigue, nerves, the thrill of being alone in the dark. That had to be it. Yet the feeling of being watched did not fade. Every shadow seemed heavier, every movement deliberate. I could feel it now, not a presence I could see, but a weight pressing at the edge of awareness. The forest was no longer empty. I took a careful step forward, then another, holding the flashlight steady. The beam cut through the darkness in thin slices, illuminating twisted roots and fallen branches. My senses were heightened. Every sound was a warning, every rustle a threat. And then I realized the whispers had stopped again, just beyond the reach of the light. A lull in the terror, only to make the next sound more shocking, more unavoidable. I was being watched, followed, hunted, though I could not see the one doing it. I forced myself to take another step, another and another. The path stretched ahead, uncertain and winding. Every shadow, every tree, every rustle carried the unspoken promise. I was not alone. I had not been alone. And I knew deep in my chest that the whispers would not stop. Not tonight, not ever. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tightly. Step by step, I moved forward into the darkness, every nerve taut, every sense on high alert. The whispers were patient, persistent, and always just beyond my perception, calling my name. I pressed forward along the trail, each step measured and deliberate, the flashlight slicing thin ribbons of light through the dark. The whispering had stopped, or at least it had faded to a memory, but the forest had not released me from its grip. My eyes darted to the shadows between the trees where the moonlight failed to reach. Shapes flickered there, fleeting, distant, yet unmistakable. I stopped. The shapes did the same. I could see them just beyond the reach of the light, dark silhouettes that seemed to mirror my posture, my slightest movement. When I lifted my arm to adjust my backpack, they lifted theirs. When I took a step forward, they moved in tandem, just beyond the underbrush. I froze, heart pounding. My logical mind searched for a reason, perhaps other hikers, perhaps deer caught in moonlight, but the timing was impossibly precise. The figures waited, silently observing as though studying me, and then in a blink they were gone. I forced myself to take a cautious step forward. The leaves crunched under my boots, and a cold breeze rustled through the canopy, making the shapes shiver like smoke in the distance. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the darkened clearing, but nothing remained. The silhouettes had vanished, leaving only the forest, quiet and indifferent once more. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, the long shadows stretching across tree trunks, forming shapes that my imagination read as movement. I told myself it was nothing. Yet even as I convinced myself, I could feel a gaze lingering, patient and silent, just beyond the reach of perception. Step by step, I moved forward, scanning the edges of the trail. Every time I paused, the shapes returned, always at the periphery, always at a distance just beyond the reach of the light. I noticed that they seemed to maintain the same relative distance, never approaching, never retreating, merely observing. I tried speaking aloud, my voice sounding small in the vast, dark expanse of the forest. "Who's there?" My words barely carried, swallowed by the trees. No reply, only the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant creak of branches. Then I saw it again, a shape, darker than the surrounding shadows, standing just beyond the bend in the path. It was tall, humanoid in form, but distorted, like a shadow stretched across a funhouse mirror. It shifted when I moved, always maintaining a distance, always mimicking my steps. I raised the flashlight and swung the beam directly at it. For a moment, it was gone. My stomach churned. My mind struggled to reconcile what I had just seen. How could something so precise in its movements disappear instantly? I felt a cold pressure settle across my shoulders, the instinctive awareness of being watched intensifying with every heartbeat. I forced myself to step forward, each movement deliberate, cautious. The shape reappeared just beyond the reach of the light, waiting, mirroring me. I stopped and it stopped. I took another step and it followed. I tried to run, but my feet felt heavy, rooted in the soft earth, as if the forest itself resisted my flight. I slowed to a crawl, forcing my mind to focus on the physical, the tangible. I counted each step. I named each tree I passed. Anything to anchor myself, to remind myself that I was in the real world, not some distorted dream. And yet, the shapes continued their eerie mimicry, patient and unyielding. I considered calling out again, perhaps trying to provoke a response, to confirm that this was not just my imagination. But the memory of the whispers from the night before stayed my voice. There was an intelligence here, a deliberate patience that made me hesitate. I did not want to draw attention. I did not want to confirm that I was aware. As I walked, I began to notice smaller details, shadows that moved against the wind, branches bending in impossible angles, leaves that seemed to fall in patterns. The shapes were not merely copies. They influenced the forest itself, bending reality just enough to unsettle the senses, to keep me unsteady. A branch snapped somewhere to my right. I turned sharply, flashlight swinging. A figure appeared, crouched low among the ferns, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw a face, featureless, blurred, yet unmistakably human in shape. Then it vanished, leaving only the black mass of the forest behind. I swallowed, my throat tight. The air felt colder now, heavier, as though it had mass, pressing down with a subtle insistence. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, each exhale a reminder that I was alive, and yet unnervingly alone. Step by step, I moved forward. The figures followed, always at the edge of the light, always just beyond clarity. I tried to take note of their form, but nothing remained consistent. One moment they were tall and thin, the next short and wide, as if the forest itself reshaped them to confuse me. I found a fallen log and paused, kneeling to adjust my gear. As I leaned forward, I caught a movement in the corner of my eye. A shape crouched behind a tree, almost perfectly still, then shifted when I turned my head, mimicking my motion. My hands shook as I raised the flashlight, sweeping it across the underbrush, but the shape had vanished once more. I forced myself to breathe deeply. My thoughts swirled between logic and instinct. I knew I was not hallucinating. There was too much consistency, too much precision in the way the shapes mirrored me. Yet there was no direct threat, no attempt to communicate, only observation, patient and unnerving. I took a cautious step forward, testing the forest's response. The shapes followed, a slow dance of mimicry, moving in time with my own motion. I could feel a rhythm to it, almost musical, as if the forest itself conducted the figures like instruments, shaping the shadows to follow me, to learn from me, to anticipate my every move. The path curved sharply and I hesitated. The shapes paused at the bend, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. I could see faint silhouettes outlined against the pale moonlight. They did not approach. They did not retreat. They waited, mirrored, observed. I wanted to run. I wanted to break free and leave this forest behind. But my legs refused, rooted in fear and awe and something darker I could not name. The shapes had patience, intelligence, a subtle menace that did not need aggression to terrify. I forced myself to move forward again. Each step was deliberate, conscious. Each breath measured. The shapes continued their silent mimicry, keeping pace without sound, without effort, just existing at the periphery of my awareness. Time lost meaning. The forest stretched infinitely in all directions. The shapes, persistent and precise, became part of the world itself. I could no longer tell where the trail ended and the shadows began. I could not tell if the light illuminated reality or merely a layer of perception shaped by the forest, by the unseen watchers. I stopped at a clearing, the moon spilling pale light across soft moss and twisted roots. The shapes paused at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light. And then, slowly, deliberately, they faded, retreating into the dark, leaving the forest silent once more. I exhaled, shaky, trembling, unsure if I had been watched for minutes or hours. The forest seemed ordinary again, quiet and still, yet I knew better. The shapes remained just beyond sight, patient, mirroring, waiting. They would return. They would never leave. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and moved forward. Step by step, careful and deliberate, I forced myself deeper into the forest, haunted by the knowledge that each movement I made was observed, mirrored, and cataloged by shadows that were not bound by the ordinary laws of the world. And somewhere just beyond the reach of moonlight the shapes waited, silent, patient, immortal. I thought I knew the trail. I thought I had memorized every turn, every fallen tree, every crooked branch marking the path back. But the forest, it seemed, had other plans. The moment I tried to retrace my steps, a familiar sense of unease settled over me. The trees, the very trees I had passed minutes before, looked wrong. Bark that had been gnarled now stretched smooth. Shadows that had fallen one way now leaned the opposite. Even the smell of the earth seemed altered, damp in a way that was almost sweet, like decay turning over too quickly. I took a step forward, then another, and suddenly I was back at the bend where I had seen the shapes the night before. My chest tightened. The same bend, the same hollow silence, the same impossibly still air. I must have walked in circles. I must have missed a turn. And yet every step felt deliberate, familiar, as though the forest was nudging me back to exactly where it wanted. I tried to convince myself it was simple disorientation, exhaustion, the long hours and dim light playing tricks on me. I even laughed quietly at my own fear, a brittle sound that seemed to shatter against the trees. But the forest didn't echo my laughter, it swallowed it. Every noise I made seemed muted, drained of meaning. The path stretched ahead, yet each time I advanced, the same trees recurred. The same fallen logs, the same twisted undergrowth. My map and compass offered no solace. The needle spun slowly, then jerked back, inconsistent, unreliable. It was as if the forest had refused to obey the rules of the world. I stopped to catch my breath, pressing my back against a thick trunk. My hands shook, my flashlight trembling in my grip. I could feel my pulse thrumming in my ears, each beat a reminder that I was utterly alone. And yet, not entirely alone. The shapes from last night returned, always at the periphery, just beyond the reach of the light, not approaching, not retreating. They moved in perfect harmony with my steps, a silent chorus that had waited for me to falter. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the path, focusing on the air, the moss, the smell of damp leaves. But they existed persistently, unnervingly, like shadows cast by my own fear. I called out softly, "Hello!" My voice was swallowed almost instantly, absorbed into the thick darkness. No reply, just the shifting shapes, waiting for me to notice them, to acknowledge their presence. The trail began to twist in ways that made no sense. A slope that had been gradual now dropped sharply. A creek that should have flowed to my left now curved to my right. I stumbled over roots that had not been there before, roots that seemed to appear just to trip me. My feet scraped over rocks, soft earth giving way where it had once been firm. Every step increased the sense of urgency and panic coiling in my chest. I tried to mark my path, scratching lines into tree bark, leaving small piles of stones. But when I doubled back, the marks were gone. No piles of stones, no scratches. It was as if the forest had erased them, denying me even the illusion of progress. A soft wind stirred the leaves, carrying a faint rustling, perhaps footsteps, perhaps the shapes themselves, moving silently through the shadows. The sound brushed against my ears, teasing, patient. I imagined whispers, faint and indistinct, never words I could understand, yet familiar enough to unsettle me. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours felt like a single, unbroken moment. The trail twisted, doubled back, and twisted again, yet every direction seemed wrong. Every path led me deeper into the forest, farther from the world I knew. I stumbled upon a clearing. For a heartbeat, I thought it was new. Pale moonlight spilled across the soft grass, a still oasis in the dark. I exhaled, relief flooding me, only to realize with sinking dread that I had been here before. The same clearing, the same pattern of roots and rocks, the same gnarled tree leaning at an impossible angle. I was trapped in a loop. Panic began to set in, subtle at first, then overwhelming. My breathing quickened. My mind raced. How could a forest loop like this? How could space bend around me, guiding me back to the same points over and over? I tried to think logically. Perhaps I had wandered into a section of dense undergrowth that twisted paths upon themselves. Perhaps the terrain was shifting with the wind, with light, with shadows. But the shapes did not shift. They remained constant, patient, observing, cataloging my movements. I tried to run. My legs pumped furiously, but the ground betrayed me. Roots reached for my feet, hidden dips caught my steps, and always at the edge of vision the shapes moved in tandem. Tall, crouched, warped, human-like, impossibly precise. They followed, yet never approached, yet always present. I fell to my knees, pressing my hands to the cold, damp earth, trying to steady my panic. My flashlight flickered, the batteries weak, the beam faltering. Shadows clung to the trees like smoke, curling and twisting, impossible to decipher. In that moment I realized I had no control. The forest was not merely a setting. It was a force, a living, breathing presence. It guided me, trapped me, played with me. And the shapes, the silent watchers, were its agents. Step by step, I forced myself forward, counting each movement. I named each tree, each stone, each bend in the path. Anything to keep my mind tethered to reality, to resist the creeping madness. Yet every time I thought I had a grasp on the trail, it twisted again, bending in ways that made no sense, folding space until I could not tell forward from backward. I stumbled upon the shapes directly this time. They were closer, emerging from the shadows with uncanny precision. I could see them clearly now, tall, humanoid, faces blurred, limbs elongated, bodies always just beyond recognition. They did not move aggressively. They did not speak. They only mirrored me, moved in rhythm with my steps, and observed. I realized with a shudder that they did not exist solely in the forest. They existed in the loop itself, in the folds of space, in the memory of the trail. They were part of the path, part of the twisting, bending forest that refused to let me leave. I was caught, not by walls, not by chains, but by the land itself. I called out again, louder this time, but my voice seemed absorbed by the night. The shapes twitched, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Their presence was a reminder that I was never truly alone, that even in solitude I was under watch. I pressed forward, forced myself to walk, one step at a time. The path curved unnaturally, the trees bending impossibly, guiding me back to the clearing, to the bend, to the same gnarled root that had tripped me hours before. The shapes remained at the edges of the light, patient, relentless, immovable. I stopped, leaning against a tree. My hands were slick with sweat, my chest heaving. I could not trust my senses, could not trust my mind. The loop had claimed all certainty, leaving only fear, observation, and the shapes, silent, patient, eternal. The forest was no longer a place to traverse. It was a mechanism, a trap, a test. I had to move, yet every movement brought me back to where I had been. Every step ensured the shapes remained, guiding me, teaching me, perhaps even enjoying the disorientation they had wrought. I realized I was not meant to leave. Perhaps I never had been. The forest had folded itself around me, and the shapes had folded with it, always present, always observing. Every effort to escape only confirmed the loop, each repetition a testament to my helplessness. I took a final, measured step into the clearing once again. The shapes stood at the edge of the light, silent, waiting, watching, and I knew deep in my chest that the forest had already decided my fate. I was caught not by trees, not by roots, not by shadows, but by the path itself. The looping trail was no longer a trail. It was a snare, and I was its prey. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of my weak flashlight, the shapes watched, patient, unyielding, eternal. I emerged from the forest just as the first gray streaks of dawn were breaking across the sky, washing the world in pale, cold light. My legs were trembling, my clothes torn and caked with mud, and the journal. I held it tight, almost as if it were a lifeline. Every step felt uncertain, every sound sharper, louder than it should have been, like my senses were stretched to the breaking point. The path behind me was empty. No shapes, no whispers, no loops, nothing but the ordinary forest morning, birds calling, leaves rustling in the gentle wind. I exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that I didn't realize I'd been holding. I told myself it was over. I had escaped. I had survived. And yet something inside me whispered a caution I could not ignore. The town was quiet, streets glinting wet from the early mist. I passed familiar houses, their doors and windows still shuttered against the chill, and I felt a strange unease at how ordinary everything seemed. The world had moved on without me, or perhaps I had moved out of step with it entirely. The journal weighed heavy in my pack, its worn cover and brittle pages a reminder of what had followed me, what had watched, what had guided me. When I reached my apartment, I noticed small things at once. The door handle felt cold, sticky almost, though the air was not humid. The welcome mat was slightly askew, though I was certain I had left it straight. I shrugged, telling myself that the wind or some animal had shifted it. Little things, nothing concrete, nothing to anchor fear. But the sense of being observed had not left me. Not entirely. Inside, the apartment smelled of dust and old wood, familiar and banal. I set down my pack, still shivering, and began to unpack, but my hands shook too much to move quickly. The journal lay on the counter, its pages splayed open as though inviting me to read again. I did not. I could not. Not yet. My mind was still wrapped in the forest, still circling the bends, the twisted paths, the shapes. I could feel them in the corners of my vision. If I looked too long, quick flashes of shadow that vanished the instant I blinked. I tried to eat. A cold breakfast, coffee, toast, but every bite felt tasteless, every sip thin. My eyes kept darting to the corners of the room. My ears strained for whispers, for the soft brushing of invisible footsteps, for the presence that refused to leave. And though the apartment was silent, I knew it was waiting, patient, watching. Sleep came reluctantly, fitful. I dreamt of the forest, of looping paths and crooked trees, of shapes that bent impossibly. I woke to the same silence I had left in the forest, yet heavier somehow, as if it pressed down from the ceiling. Morning had arrived, but the light brought no comfort. I could not shake the feeling that the forest had followed me, that the shapes had found a way to slip into my world. Days passed. I tried to live as I had before. I walked streets I knew, met friends, went to the market, handled mundane chores. And yet the small signs persisted. A shadow flickering across the wall just beyond my sight, a scraping sound on the balcony late at night, the faintest trace of wet earth on my shoes when I knew I had cleaned them thoroughly. Subtle things, easily explained, yet each explanation felt thin, unsatisfying, inadequate. I told myself I was imagining it, that the forest had been a dream, that exhaustion and fear had warped reality. I told myself stories to rationalize, to quiet the growing panic under my skin. But rationalization did not hold. I could feel it in the air, the pressure behind my eyes, the subtle tug at the edge of perception. Something had come home with me, silent and unassuming, and it was patient. It waited for the moment I was weakest, for the moment I let my guard down. I began noticing small changes in my apartment. A window left open that I was certain I had shut. A book slightly moved on the shelf. The journal, which I had left closed, sometimes appeared open to pages I did not remember reading, words blurred as if they had shifted while I slept. I touched them, tried to erase them with my fingers, but they held fast, the ink dry and dark, almost sticky to the touch. Night after night, I lay in bed listening. At first, it was only my own imagination, I told myself. But then I heard it clearly, soft scraping against the walls, almost like fingernails dragging across plaster. The whispering returned too, more subtle, more insidious than in the forest. No words I could understand, just hissing, sighing breath that felt too close, too intimate, and yet not human. I could feel it watching, waiting, testing. Its presence was a shadow that did not belong to me, a chill that did not belong to the room. I tried to confront it, to speak aloud, to call it by name, to claim control, but the silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt in the forest. It did not respond. It merely waited, patient, deliberate. I noticed things in reflections. Windows, mirrors, the darkened surface of my phone screen. Shapes at the edge of vision, indistinct but humanoid, always just beyond comprehension. I would look directly and they would vanish. I would blink and they were there again, closer, observing, mocking. The journal became both comfort and terror. I read the entries again and again, tracing the words, hopping for understanding. But every passage now seemed alive. Words shifted on the page, lines that had been straight curved like roots in the soil. Ink bled into new phrases, warnings not from the author but from the thing that had followed me home. I stopped leaving the apartment when the sun set. The city outside could not touch the forest, could not undo what had come. I barricaded doors, checked locks, set alarms, but the presence ignored these measures. It was patient, silent, watching. It did not need to act. Its mere presence was enough to warp my thoughts, to make sleep a battlefield, to make sanity a fragile veneer. Sometimes I thought I could hear it breathing. A rhythm not my own, steady and slow, syncing with my own pulse, reminding me I was not alone. Other times I would catch the faintest outline in the corner of my eye, A shadow taller than any human, impossibly still, with eyes that seemed to burn with a pale inner light. And each time I realized I could not look too long. Recognition invited proximity. Attention was dangerous. I tried to escape again, to leave the apartment, to leave the city. But every path felt like the forest, twisting, folding, looping. Even streets I knew seemed unfamiliar, alleys turning back on themselves, shadows shifting in impossible ways. The shapes followed, always at the edge, always patient. The forest had come to me, folded into my reality, and there was no escaping it. I have learned small routines to cope. I do not speak aloud when I am alone. I avoid reflective surfaces when possible. I leave food out, small offerings on counters and shelves, hoping it will distract the watcher, satisfy its attention elsewhere. None of it works. I can feel its patience stretching across hours, days, weeks. Time itself bends in its presence. And yet I remain. I remain because I cannot leave, because to leave is to invite it closer, because I am tethered now to the forest, even here. The journal sits open on the table, its pages fluttering gently, as if breathing. I do not touch it anymore. I do not read it anymore. I only watch, I only wait, and I only exist in the shadows it casts. Sometimes I wonder if it follows me when I sleep, if it watches while I dream, if the shapes I glimpsed were merely scouts preparing the way for something that will not remain patient forever. But then I remind myself, patience is its nature, waiting is its power, and I am a mark, forever tethered, forever observed, forever ensnared. The forest is no longer a place. It is a presence. It is here in my walls, in my floors, in the quiet moments when I think I am safe. And I cannot leave. I cannot flee. I can only live with the knowledge that the shapes followed me home, and that silence can be louder than any scream. And so I sit, night after night, waiting for something that may never act and yet always exists. I have returned from the looping paths and the unseen watchers, but the farewell was not mine to give. The forest and what it sent followed me, silent, patient, eternal, and I will never truly be alone again.